Elena Marchetti's hands were shaking so badly that she almost dropped her phone on the marble steps of the Castellano estate. She had exactly 4 minutes to get inside, before the doors closed, and she could already hear music spilling out from behind the tall windows, warm gold light falling across the snow, like something from a dream she had no right to be standing in. She had not chosen this dress. She had not chosen any of this. 3 hours earlier, her sister Grace had been rushed to the hospital with a sprained ankle, and Elena, still covered in flower stems and ribbon from her shop, had been handed a garment bag and a set of car keys, and told to go in her place. There had been no time to think about what she was wearing. There had been no time to think about anything, except getting there before the invitation expired. The gown was ivory. It fit her like it had been made for her, soft and heavy at the same time, the kind of dress that made people stop talking when she walked past. She had thought, standing in front of the mirror at the boutique, that it was simply beautiful, elegant, appropriate for a black-tie winter ball hosted by one of the wealthiest families in the city. She had no idea that the color itself was a message. She had no idea that in the world she was about to step into, colors spoke louder than words. The doors opened before she reached them, pulled wide by a man in a dark suit, who looked at her for a long second, his expression shifting from polite welcome to something closer to shock. Elena smiled at him the way she smiled at difficult customers, warm and steady, and walked past before he could say anything strange. Inside, the ballroom was enormous. Chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls above a floor, so polished it reflected the dancers moving across it. Elena had done flowers for weddings that cost less than the centerpieces alone must have cost. She kept her chin up and reminded herself that she was only here for one night, to stand in for her sister, smile politely at people she would never see again, and leave with her dignity intact. That plan lasted exactly 90 seconds. The moment she stepped further into the room, the conversation near her seemed to catch and pause, like a record skipping. She noticed it first as a strange silence spreading outward, guest by guest, the way ripples move across still water. Then she noticed the stares. Not admiring glances, not the kind of attention a beautiful dress might earn at any party. These were stares full of disbelief. Whispers passed hand to hand behind fans and champagne glasses. Elena told herself it was nothing. Maybe her hem was crooked. Maybe there was something in her hair. She reached up self-consciously and touched the pins holding her dark curls in place, everything exactly as it should be. She kept walking, searching for a familiar face, someone from the family friend group her sister had mentioned, anyone who might explain what she was supposed to do next. She found no one she recognized. Instead, she found a woman in emerald green, staring at her from across the room, with an expression Elena could only describe as fury wrapped in silk. The woman turned and said something sharp to the man beside her, who glanced at Elena and then quickly looked away, as though catching her eye might mean something he did not want to be part of. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne, and Elena took a glass gratefully, if only to have something to do with her hands. She sipped it slowly, scanning the crowd, feeling more like an actress who had wandered onto the wrong stage than a guest at a party. It was then that she saw him. He was taller than most of the men around him, with dark hair swept back and the kind of stillness that made him easy to pick out even in a crowded room. He wore a black suit with no tie, the top button of his shirt undone, as though he had given up on formality somewhere around hour 2 of standing there being admired by strangers. He was talking to an older woman with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, nodding along to whatever she was saying, but his attention kept drifting, sliding across the room like he was looking for an exit that did not exist. Then his eyes landed on Elena. She watched something change in his face. Not admiration, not exactly. Something closer to disbelief, the same disbelief she had seen rippling through the crowd since she arrived. Except on him, it looked different, sharper, more personal. He said something quickly to the woman beside him, who turned to look at Elena as well, her sharp eyes narrowing with an intensity that made Elena's stomach drop. The man began walking toward her. Elena's first instinct was to turn and find the nearest exit, but there was nowhere to go that would not have looked strange, and some stubborn part of her refused to run from a party simply because people were staring. She had grown up the daughter of a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night to pay for flower arranging classes Elena begged to take. She had learned a long time ago how to hold her ground in rooms that did not want her in them. So she stood still, glass in hand, and waited. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell something like cedar and rain. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. Up close, he was even more striking than he had seemed from across the room, with dark eyes that seemed to be doing rapid calculations behind a carefully composed expression. "I don't believe we've met," he said finally, his voice low and controlled, though there was an undercurrent of something else beneath it. Amusement, maybe, or disbelief, still trying to settle into something calmer. "Elena," she said, offering her hand, because it seemed like the thing to do, though her heart was pounding hard enough that she worried he could see it in the pulse at her throat. "Elena Marchetti." He took her hand, and instead of shaking it the way she expected, he held it for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes flicking down to the dress and back up to her face, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle that refused to make sense. "Damien Castellano," he said. "This is my family's home." Elena's stomach dropped further. Of course it was. Of course the man walking toward her with that unreadable expression was the heir to the entire evening. The reason 200 people in designer gowns and tailored suits were currently standing in this room pretending not to watch the two of them. "It's a beautiful home," she said, because it was true, and because she could not think of anything else to say that would not reveal how completely out of her depth she felt. "Thank you," he said, and then, more quietly, leaning slightly closer so that only she could hear him, "Can I ask you something? And I hope this doesn't come across as strange." "Of course. Did you know what you were wearing tonight?" Elena blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The color," he said, gesturing slightly at her dress, careful not to actually touch it. "Did someone tell you to wear ivory? Did someone suggest it to you?" "I borrowed it this afternoon," Elena admitted, feeling suddenly foolish, though she still had no idea why the question mattered so much. "My sister was supposed to come tonight, but she hurt her ankle, and I was asked to take her place at the last minute. I didn't have time to shop. This was the only formal dress the boutique had in my size." Something shifted in Damien's face as she spoke, the tension in his jaw easing slightly, replaced by something that looked almost like relief, though it was quickly hidden again behind polite composure. "I see," he said. "Is something wrong with it?" Elena asked, glancing down at the dress as though it might have betrayed her without her knowledge. "Did I break some kind of dress code? I can leave, if this is a problem. I really don't want to embarrass anyone." "No," Damien said quickly, and then, after a pause, "It's complicated. It's a family thing. I'll explain, but not here, not with half the room listening in." He glanced meaningfully around them, and Elena realized with a start that several small clusters of guests were indeed watching them with open curiosity, no longer even pretending to look away. "Okay," Elena said slowly, though her curiosity was quickly turning into genuine worry. "You're starting to make me nervous." A faint smile crossed his face, the first real one she had seen since he approached her. "You should be a little nervous," he said, "but not for the reason you think." Before Elena could ask what that meant, the silver-haired woman from earlier appeared at Damien's side, moving with the kind of quiet authority that made the surrounding guests instinctively part to let her through. Up close, she was smaller than Elena expected, but her presence filled the space around her completely, sharp eyes taking in every detail of Elena's appearance in a single sweeping glance. "Introduce me, Damien," the woman said, her voice carrying the faint trace of an accent Elena couldn't quite place. "Nana, this is Elena Marchetti," Damien said, and Elena noted the careful, measured way he said it, like a man picking his way across ice. "Elena, this is my grandmother, Sofia Castellano." "Elena?" Sofia repeated, testing the name in her mouth as though weighing it. Her gaze moved once more to the ivory dress, and something in her expression softened in a way that made Elena feel strangely exposed, as though the older woman could see straight through the fabric to whatever confusion lay underneath it. "It is a lovely name," Sofia said finally, "and a lovely choice of color, for tonight of all nights." "Thank you," Elena said carefully, unsure what else to offer. Sofia reached out and took both of Elena's hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small, her rings cold against Elena's skin. "Welcome to our family, dear girl," she said, and there were tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her sharp eyes. "Welcome." Elena's heart stumbled. She looked to Damien for help, for some sign of what was happening, but he only offered her a tight, complicated smile, the kind that promised explanation later, and asked, silently, for patience now. Around them, the whispers grew louder, and Elena realized with rising panic that the entire ballroom seemed to be turning to watch, phones lifting discreetly from pockets and purses, champagne glasses forgotten in hands, as 200 strangers waited to see what would happen next, between the woman in the ivory dress and the man everyone in the city knew would one day inherit everything in this room. Elena had absolutely no idea what she had just agreed to. She only knew, with a growing certainty that made her palms sweat inside her borrowed gloves, that whatever it was, there was no simple way to walk it back now. Sophia released her hands and turned to address a passing servant, calling for champagne to be brought for a toast, her voice carrying easily over the string quartet's music. Somewhere behind Elena, the woman in emerald green was watching, with an expression that had curdled from fury into something colder and more calculating. Elena felt a chill move down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter night outside. "We need to talk," she whispered to Damien, keeping her smile fixed in place for the benefit of the watching crowd. "Right now." "I know," he murmured back, offering her his arm with practiced ease, the picture of a perfect gentleman escorting his date, even as his voice carried an urgency that matched her own. "Follow my lead. Smile. I'll explain everything the second we're out of sight." Elena took his arm, feeling the eyes of the entire ballroom follow them, as Damien guided her toward the terrace doors at the far end of the room, away from his grandmother's beaming face and the sea of curious strangers. Whatever mistake she had made by wearing this dress, it was clearly far bigger than a simple fashion misstep, and something told her that by the time she learned the truth, her quiet, uncomplicated life would already be changed beyond recognition. The cold night air hit her the moment Damien pulled the terrace door shut behind them, muffling the music and chatter into a distant hum. Snow had begun to fall lightly over the gardens below, and for a moment neither of them spoke, both catching their breath in the sudden quiet. "Okay," Elena said, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. "Tell me what is going on. Tell me right now, before I go back in there and make things worse." Damien turned to face her fully, his dark eyes serious in the moonlight, and Elena braced herself for whatever strange, impossible truth was about to change the course of her evening. "In my family," he said slowly, "there is an old tradition. It goes back generations, long before my grandmother was born. At our winter ball, if a woman arrives wearing ivory, it means one thing, and one thing only, to everyone in that room." "What does it mean?" Elena asked, though some instinct in her had already begun to guess, dread pooling low in her stomach. Damien held her gaze, his expression unreadable in the falling snow. "It means she is accepting a proposal," he said quietly. "It means, as far as my entire family is concerned, that you and I are now engaged." The music inside seemed to swell for a moment, and Elena felt the cold air rush into her lungs as she tried to process what he had just said, the enormous, impossible weight of a single borrowed dress suddenly pressing down on her shoulders like the whole winter sky. "That's impossible," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't propose to anyone. I didn't accept anything. I put on a dress because it was the only one that fit." "I believe you," Damien said quickly. "I do. But belief doesn't change what just happened in that ballroom. My grandmother has been waiting for this moment for years. She has told every relative, every family friend, every business partner we have, that the day I finally choose someone, everyone will know it the moment she walks through those doors in ivory. That tradition is older than either of us. It has never once been wrong." "Until tonight," Elena said weakly. "Until tonight," he agreed, and something in the way he said it made her look up sharply, searching his face for mockery or anger, and finding neither. "You have to fix this," Elena said, panic rising in her chest now that the shock was beginning to wear off. "You have to go back in there and tell everyone it was a mistake. Tell them I'm nobody. Tell them I borrowed the wrong dress from the wrong boutique on the worst night of my life." "I could do that," Damien said slowly, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "But I want you to think about what happens next if I do." "What do you mean?" "My grandmother is 78 years old," he said. "She has a weak heart, and she has spent the last 5 years of her life terrified that our family's name will end with me, unmarried, uninterested, disappointing everyone who came before us. If I walk back in there and announce, in front of 200 guests, that the woman she just welcomed into our family with tears in her eyes was actually a stranger who wore the wrong dress by accident, it will not just embarrass you. It will break something in her that I am not sure can be repaired." Elena felt the weight of his words settle over her, heavier even than the cold night air. She thought of her own grandmother, gone 5 years now, and the particular ache of watching someone you loved grow smaller and more fragile with each passing season. She understood, suddenly and completely, exactly what Damien was asking her not to do. "So what do you want me to do instead?" she asked quietly. "Pretend? For how long?" "I don't know yet," Damien admitted, "but I know we can't solve it standing out here freezing, while 200 people inside speculate about where we've disappeared to." He glanced back toward the terrace doors, where the golden light spilled out onto the snow-dusted stone, and Elena saw, for just a moment, the exhaustion beneath his composed exterior, the weight of a life spent being watched, measured, and expected to perform. "They're going to ask questions," Elena said. "Your grandmother already called me part of the family. What am I supposed to say when someone asks how we met?" "Let me handle tonight," Damien said. "Just tonight. Stay close to me. Smile when I smile. And let me do the talking. Tomorrow, when everyone has had time to sleep and the shock has worn off a little, we can figure out how to fix this properly. I promise you, Elena, I am not going to let you walk out of here with your reputation dragged through gossip columns because of something that was never your fault." Elena studied him for a long moment, snow gathering silently in her dark curls, and something about the sincerity in his voice, the genuine worry in his eyes, made her decision for her, before she had fully weighed the risk. "One night," she said finally. "I can manage one night." Damien exhaled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders, and for the first time since she had noticed him across the crowded ballroom, he offered her a real smile, small and grateful, and entirely unguarded. "Thank you," he said. "I know this isn't what you signed up for." "No," Elena agreed, managing a shaky laugh despite everything. "I signed up to stand in for my sister and eat some very expensive appetizers. Instead, I appear to be engaged to a man I met 4 minutes ago." Damien laughed too, low and surprised, as though he had not expected to find any humor left in the evening at all. "Welcome to my family," he said, echoing his grandmother's words with a wry twist that made Elena smile, despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest. Somewhere beyond the terrace doors, the music shifted into something slower, and Elena knew their absence would not go unnoticed for much longer. She squared her shoulders, tucked her fear down somewhere she could examine it later, and let Damien lead her back toward the golden light, back into a ballroom full of strangers who now believed, with absolute certainty, that her entire future had just been decided by a single borrowed dress. She had no way of knowing yet that this single night, this one impossible misunderstanding, was about to unravel everything she thought she knew about her own quiet, careful life, and that walking back through those doors on Damien Castellano's arm was only the very beginning. The emerald green dress belonged to a woman named Priya Kapoor, and by the time Elena and Damien stepped back into the ballroom, Priya had already positioned herself near the champagne fountain with 3 of her closest friends, watching the terrace doors like a hawk waiting for the exact moment to strike. Elena felt the weight of the woman's stare the second they re-entered the room, sharp and unblinking, but Damien's hand at the small of her back steadied her, guiding her gently toward a quieter corner near the string quartet, rather than straight back into the center of attention. "Who is that?" Elena murmured, tilting her head almost imperceptibly toward Priya. "A family friend," Damien said carefully, though something in his tone suggested there was more to the story than those 3 simple words. "Her father does business with mine. She's been to every winter ball since we were children. She looks like she wants to set my dress on fire." Damien's mouth twitched, fighting a smile he clearly felt was inappropriate for the moment. "She might," he admitted. "I'll explain later. Right now, smile. My Aunt Lucia is heading this way, and she has never once in her life kept an opinion to herself." Elena barely had time to arrange her features into something resembling calm before a tall woman in deep burgundy swept toward them, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. a glass of red wine held aloft like a weapon she had not yet decided whether to use. "So this is her," Lucia said, looking Elena up and down with an intensity that made Elena feel like a piece of art being appraised at auction. "Damien, you could have warned someone. Your mother nearly fainted when Sophia announced it across the ballroom." "There wasn't exactly time for a warning, Aunt Lucia," Damien said smoothly. "These things tend to happen quickly, or not at all." Clearly. Lucia's sharp eyes turned back to Elena, softening only slightly. "And you, dear? What do you do when you're not stealing hearts at family events?" "I own a flower shop," Elena said, deciding honesty was safer ground than invention, at least for now. "Small. Nothing like this. I do weddings mostly. Some funerals." "A florist," Lucia repeated, as though testing the word for hidden flaws. How refreshingly ordinary. Elena wasn't certain if that was meant as an insult, but Damien's hand tightened almost imperceptibly at her back, a silent signal of reassurance, and she found herself standing a little straighter under his aunt's assessing gaze. "I find ordinary things are usually the ones that last," Elena said, meeting Lucia's eyes without flinching. Flowers included. Something shifted in Lucia's expression, a flicker of genuine interest replacing the initial suspicion. "Well," she said finally, raising her wineglass slightly in something like a toast. "We'll see, won't we?" She moved on to greet other guests, leaving Elena to release a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Damien leaned down slightly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You did well," he said. "My aunt doesn't hand out approval easily." "I don't think that was approval," Elena said. "I think that was a woman deciding whether I'm worth the trouble of disliking properly." Damien laughed, a real laugh this time, surprised out of him despite the tension still coiled beneath his polished exterior. Across the room, Elena noticed Priya watching them with narrowed eyes, her friends whispering behind cupped hands. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions. Elena knew she would never fully remember, names and faces blending together into a soft gold haze of chandeliers and clinking glasses. She met Damien's father, a quiet, watchful man who studied her with the same careful calculation Damien himself often wore. She met a business partner from overseas who spoke rapidly about shipping routes and seemed entirely uninterested in the fact that Elena had no idea what he was talking about. Through it all, Damien stayed close, his presence a steady anchor in a room that threatened, at every turn, to sweep her entirely off balance. It was nearly midnight when Sophia finally approached them again, her sharp eyes soft with an emotion Elena still felt she had no right to witness. The older woman took both of Elena's hands once more, her rings cold against Elena's palms. "I want to tell you something," Sophia said quietly, drawing Elena a few steps away from Damien, toward the edge of the dance floor, where the noise of the party thinned slightly. "I have watched my grandson close himself off for years. Since his mother's illness, since the business troubles his father will not speak of at parties, he has built walls so high, I stopped believing anyone could climb them." Elena's stomach twisted with guilt, the enormity of the lie she was living pressing harder against her chest with every word the old woman spoke. "Mrs. Castellano." "Sophia, please." "Sophia," Elena corrected gently. "I don't think you understand." "I understand more than you think," Sophia said, patting Elena's hand with surprising firmness. "I understand that tonight, for the first time in longer than I can remember, my grandson laughed like he meant it. I understand that whatever brought you to that door in that dress, it was not an accident of fate. Some things are simply meant to happen, dear girl, whether we plan for them or not." Elena opened her mouth to explain, to finally tell the truth and let the consequences fall where they would, but something in Sophia's face stopped her, some fragile hope she could not bring herself to shatter with a single sentence at midnight, surrounded by strangers who had already begun to believe in a story that was not entirely true. "I hope I don't disappoint you," Elena said instead, the words feeling both like a lie and like the truest thing she had said all evening. "You could never," Sophia said, and released her hands with a final gentle squeeze, before moving off to speak with another cluster of guests, leaving Elena standing alone at the edge of the dance floor, guilt and confusion warring in her chest. Damien appeared at her side moments later, offering his arm once more. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said quietly. "Your grandmother just told me I make you laugh for the first time in years," Elena said, I have known you for approximately 3 hours. She's not wrong, Damien said, and something in the honesty of his tone caught Elena off guard, made her look up sharply into his dark eyes, searching for the joke she was certain must be hiding there. She found none. Damien. I know, he said quietly, cutting off whatever protest she had been about to make. I know this is complicated and strange, and not remotely what either of us expected walking into tonight. But something about the way you handled my aunt, the way you're handling all of this right now, tells me you're not the kind of person who runs from difficult things. I'm really not, Elena admitted, which is probably why I haven't already sprinted for the nearest exit. Good, Damien said, and there was warmth in his voice now, something that had not been there during their tense conversation on the terrace. Because the night isn't over yet, and I still owe you a dance, if the rest of the ballroom is going to keep watching us as closely as they have been. Elena glanced around and realized he was right. Even now, at nearly midnight, eyes still drifted toward them in careful, curious sweeps, phones still lifted discreetly to capture a photo of the mysterious woman who had walked in wearing ivory and somehow ended the season's biggest question about the Castellano heir's future. One dance, Elena said, allowing herself, for the first time all evening, to actually enjoy the strange, impossible situation she found herself in. But you should know, I haven't danced properly since my cousin's wedding 3 years ago, and I stepped on the groom's foot twice. I'll take my chances, Damien said, and led her onto the floor as the quartet shifted into something slow and sweeping, snow still falling silently beyond the tall windows, the whole golden room seeming to hold its breath around them. As they moved together, Elena caught sight of Priya once more, standing rigid near the edge of the room, her expression no longer simply jealous but something colder, more deliberate, the look of a woman quietly calculating her next move, rather than mourning a loss she had not yet accepted as final. Elena felt a small chill move through her, despite the warmth of the crowded ballroom, some instinct warning her that whatever fragile peace she had found tonight was far from secure. But for now, wrapped in the music and the golden light, and the surprising, steady warmth of Damien's hand at her waist, Elena allowed herself to simply exist in the moment. One dance, one night, one impossible mistake she had not yet found the courage to unmake. The ball ended shortly after 1 in the morning, guests trickling out through the grand front doors into waiting cars, snow still drifting lazily through the porch lights. Damien walked Elena to the small, battered sedan she had borrowed from her sister, his expression turning serious once more, now that the crowd had thinned enough to allow an honest conversation. Tomorrow, he said, we need to talk properly, figure out what happens next, how we handle this without hurting anyone, especially my grandmother. Tomorrow, Elena agreed, exhaustion finally catching up with her now that the adrenaline of the evening had begun to fade. Though I should warn you, my shop opens at 7. I have a wedding order due by 9, and no assistant to help me finish it if I sleep through my alarm. Then I'll come to you, Damien said, surprising her. Your shop, 7:30 if that works. We can talk somewhere with fewer chandeliers, and considerably less an audience. Elena studied him for a moment, snow settling softly onto his dark hair, the golden light of the estate glowing warmly behind him, and felt the strange, dizzying awareness that whatever had begun tonight, whatever accidental promise her borrowed dress had made on her behalf, it was not going to be as easily undone as she had first hoped. 7:30, she agreed, sliding into the driver's seat before the cold, or the confusion, or the lingering warmth of his hand at her waist could convince her to change her mind. Don't be late. I don't do well with surprises before my coffee. Given the last few hours, Damien said, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth as he stepped back to let her close the door. I think we're both a little overdue for a morning with no surprises at all. Elena drove away from the glowing estate with her heart still racing, the borrowed ivory dress pooling around her like something out of a story she had never meant to be part of, already certain that tomorrow's conversation would be far more complicated than either of them wanted to admit. Elena's flower shop sat on a quiet corner 2 streets back from the harbor, its windows always slightly fogged from the buckets of fresh stems kept cool near the door. She had inherited the lease from the previous owner 5 years earlier, back when the shop had been little more than a narrow storefront with peeling paint, and a reputation for wilted carnations. She had spent every spare hour and every spare dollar turning it into something people trusted, something with her name, quietly stitched into its identity, one careful arrangement at a time. She arrived at 6:15 the next morning, her eyes heavy from only a few hours of restless sleep, her mind still tangled in golden ballroom light and the low, steady sound of Damien's voice. She unlocked the front door, flipped on the lights, and set to work on the wedding order due by 9, grateful for the familiar rhythm of stripping thorns and trimming stems, anything to keep her hands busy, while her thoughts kept drifting back to the impossible promise sewn into a borrowed ivory dress. At exactly 7:30, the small brass bell above the door chimed, and Elena looked up to find Damien standing just inside the entrance, dressed down now in a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, looking so different from the polished, composed man of the night before, that for a moment she almost didn't recognize him. He held 2 coffee cups, one of which he offered to her with a slightly sheepish expression. "I didn't know how you'd take it," he admitted, "so I got you 3 different kinds of everything. Cream, sugar, both, neither. I wasn't taking chances." Elena accepted the cup nearest to her, a small, surprised laugh escaping, despite the tension still knotted in her chest. "You didn't have to do that. I wanted to make a decent first impression, given the ridiculous one I've already left you with," Damien said, glancing around the shop with open curiosity, taking in the buckets of roses and eucalyptus, the work table scattered with ribbon and wire, the faint scent of green stems and cold water that clung to everything. "This is a lovely place," he added, and Elena heard genuine warmth in his voice, rather than polite performance. "Thank you," she said, setting down her shears and wiping her hands on her apron, before gesturing toward the small seating area near the window. 2 mismatched chairs she kept for clients, who needed to sit and cry over funeral arrangements, or laugh over wedding colors. "Sit. Tell me how bad the damage is this morning." Damien sat, cradling his coffee, his earlier ease fading slightly as the weight of the conversation settled back over them. "My grandmother called me at 6, he said. "She wants to host a dinner next week. Family only, though with my family, that still means at least 30 people. She wants to properly welcome you." Elena's stomach dropped. "Damien, we can't keep doing this. Every day we don't correct this, it gets bigger. It gets harder to unravel." "I know," Damien said, running a hand through his hair, the gesture more tired than she had seen from him even at the height of last night's exhaustion. "But I spoke to my father this morning too. He mentioned, almost in passing, that my grandmother's cardiologist called last week with concerning news. Nothing urgent, he said, but nothing he wanted dismissed either. She's been under a strange kind of pressure lately, worrying about the business, worrying about me, worrying about a legacy she isn't sure will survive past her." Elena set her coffee down carefully, feeling the full weight of what he was describing. "That's not fair to put on either of us," she said quietly, though she understood, with growing discomfort, exactly why he was telling her. "I'm not asking you to stay engaged to me forever," Damien said quickly. "I would never ask that of a stranger, no matter how complicated the situation. But I am asking if you might be willing to give this a little more time. Not months. Not some grand, dramatic charade. Just enough time for my grandmother's health to stabilize. Enough time for me to find the right way to tell her the truth, without it feeling like a blow to her heart, in the most literal sense." Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing the request against every instinct that told her to simply walk away from a situation that had nothing to do with her real life. But she thought of Sophia's tear-filled eyes at the ball, the fragile hope in her voice, and found she could not entirely dismiss the request as easily as she wanted to. "What would this actually look like?" Elena asked carefully. "Practically, if I agreed." "A few public appearances," Damien said. "Dinner with my family next week. Perhaps a business event or two. Nothing extravagant. In exchange, I would compensate you fairly for your time, and for any complications this causes with your business or your schedule. I know this isn't something anyone should be asked to do for nothing." Elena bristled slightly at the mention of payment, some old pride flaring in her chest. But she also thought of the mounting bills stacked on her desk in the back room, the walk-in cooler that had been making an alarming noise for weeks, the assistant she desperately needed to hire but couldn't yet afford. Practicality won out over pride, if only barely. "I'll think about it," she said finally, "but I want conditions. I want a clear timeline, even if it's flexible. I want to know exactly what I'm agreeing to, before I agree to anything else." "Fair," Damien said, relief evident in the loosening of his shoulders. More than fair. The bell above the door chimed again, and Elena's assistant for the wedding order, a nervous teenager named Oliver who worked part-time after school, poked his head in, eyes going wide at the sight of a stranger, sitting in the shop's small seating area, at 7:40 in the morning. Elena stood quickly, professional instincts kicking back in. "I need to finish this order," she said. "Give me your number. I'll call you tonight, once I've had time to think properly, without an audience, and without a beautiful dress clouding my judgment." Damien smiled, standing as well, and wrote his number on a scrap of ribbon paper from her work table, before heading for the door. He paused there, hand on the brass handle, and looked back at her, with an expression that was harder to read than any he had shown her the night before. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "whatever you decide, thank you for not exposing me last night. You could have, most people would have, just to watch the story unfold in front of an audience." "I'm not most people," Elena said, echoing something close to what she'd told his aunt the night before, and Damien's smile deepened slightly, before he nodded once, and stepped out into the cold morning, the bell chiming softly behind him. Elena stood alone in her shop for a long moment after he left, staring at the scrap of ribbon paper in her hand, the ink already smudging slightly from the damp morning air, and wondered exactly what she had just agreed to think about. Elena did not call that night, not because she had decided against Damien's proposal, but because Grace showed up at her apartment at 9 in the evening, ankle wrapped in a stiff brace, demanding a full account of the ball she had missed. Elena spent an hour recounting the evening in careful, edited pieces, leaving out the parts that still felt too enormous to say out loud, watching her sister's expression shift from amusement to disbelief to something close to alarm. "You're engaged," Grace said flatly, sitting up straighter on Elena's worn couch. "To a man you spoke to for 4 hours. Because of a dress." "I'm not actually engaged," Elena corrected, though even to her own ears, the distinction sounded thin. "His family believes I am. There's a difference." "Is there?" Grace asked, arching an eyebrow that reminded Elena uncomfortably of their mother. "Because from where I'm sitting, that sounds like the exact same problem, just with better public relations." Elena didn't have a good answer for that, so she busied herself refilling their tea instead, buying time, while she tried to organize the tangled mess of thoughts that had kept her awake most of the previous night. She had gone over Damien's proposal from every angle, weighing risk against reward, pride against practicality, and had still not landed on a decision she felt entirely confident in. "He offered to pay me," she admitted finally, sitting back down across from her sister, "for a few weeks of appearances, dinners, maybe an event or two. Enough time for his grandmother's health to stabilize before he tells her the truth." Grace's expression softened slightly at the mention of the grandmother, though her caution remained. "And you believe him? About the health thing? You've known this man for one night." "I don't know if I believe him completely," Elena admitted, "but I believe what I saw in her face at that party. I believe she wasn't performing for an audience when she took my hands and told me she'd been waiting years for her grandson to laugh like that again. Some things aren't easy to fake, Grace, not even for people with that much money." Grace studied her sister for a long moment, something knowing creeping into her expression. "This isn't just about the walk-in cooler and the assistant you need to hire, is it?" Elena flushed, caught out by her sister's sharp perception. "It's practical," she insisted. "The money would help. A lot, actually. But that's not the whole reason." "Then what's the whole reason?" Elena hesitated, turning her teacup slowly in her hands, trying to find words for a feeling she hadn't fully examined even in her own mind. "For one night," she said finally, "I stood in a room full of people who had everything, and somehow, I wasn't invisible. He looked at me like I mattered, Grace. Not because of what I could do for him, or how I could make his family look at a party. Just because of something he saw when he actually looked at me. I haven't felt that in a long time." Grace's teasing expression gentled into something more understanding, memories of their own complicated dating histories passing silently between them. "Just be careful," she said finally. "Whatever this becomes, real or pretend, you're the one who has to live with the consequences when it ends. And things like this always end eventually, one way or another." Elena nodded, accepting the warning even as some stubborn, hopeful part of her chose not to fully absorb it. Later that night, once Grace had gone home and the apartment had settled into quiet, Elena finally picked up her phone and dialed the number written on the smudged ribbon paper. Damien answered on the second ring, his voice carrying a note of surprise. "I wasn't sure you'd actually call." "I said I would," Elena said. "I keep my promises, even the ones I'm not entirely sure about yet." "That's reassuring, given the current circumstances," Damien said, and Elena could hear the faint smile in his voice. "I have conditions," she said, steadying herself with the businesslike tone she used when negotiating vendor contracts for her shop. "First, this ends within 6 weeks, no matter what happens with your grandmother's health. I won't be strung along indefinitely." "Agreed," Damien said without hesitation. "Second, I keep running my shop exactly as I always have. Whatever appearances or events you need me at, they need to work around my actual life, not replace it." "Of course." "Third," Elena continued, her voice softening slightly, despite her best efforts to keep things professional. "If either of us starts to feel like this is becoming something more complicated than a business arrangement, we talk about it honestly. No pretending, no letting confusion build until it becomes a mess neither of us can clean up." There was a pause on the other end of the line, longer than she expected, before Damien spoke again, his voice quieter now, more serious. "I think that's a wise condition," he said. "I'll agree to all three." "Then I suppose we have a deal," Elena said, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "We have a deal," Damien confirmed. "My grandmother's dinner is Thursday. I'll pick you up at 6, unless you'd rather meet there." "You can pick me up," Elena said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. "Just don't bring 3 different coffees this time. I've already decided I like mine simple. Cream, no sugar." "Noted," Damien said, and Elena could hear the genuine warmth returning to his voice, the same warmth she had noticed on the dance floor the night before, steady and unhurried, in a way that made her chest feel strangely tight. "Elena, thank you. Truly. I know this is a strange, unusual thing to ask of anyone, and I don't take it lightly." "I know you don't," Elena said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. They said their goodbyes shortly after, and Elena sat alone in her quiet apartment for a long while afterward, staring at the ribbon paper still resting on her coffee table, wondering if she had just made the most practical decision of her life, or the most reckless one, and increasingly uncertain which possibility frightened her more. The following days passed in a strange, suspended rhythm, Elena's ordinary life continuing alongside the surreal new arrangement she had agreed to. She filled orders, delivered arrangements, argued cheerfully with her wholesale supplier about the price of imported peonies, and in quiet moments between tasks, found her mind drifting back to golden ballroom light and the low, steady sound of Damien's voice. Thursday arrived faster than she expected. She closed the shop early, changed into a simple navy dress she had chosen carefully to avoid any accidental symbolism this time, and was ready and waiting when Damien's car pulled up outside her apartment building at exactly 6 o'clock, punctual in a way that suggested careful intention rather than mere habit. "You look lovely," he said, as she climbed into the passenger seat, and something in the simple, unguarded sincerity of the compliment made her cheeks warm, despite the cold evening air. "Ready to face round 2? She asked, buckling her seatbelt as he pulled away from the curb. "Almost," Damien said, glancing at her, with an expression that mixed reassurance with a trace of genuine nervousness she hadn't expected from him. "There's something I should probably tell you before we get there. About Priya." Elena's stomach tightened at the mention of the woman in emerald green, remembering the cold, calculating look that had followed them across the ballroom floor. "What about her?" "She'll be at dinner tonight," Damien said carefully. "Our families have been close for years. There was, at one point, an expectation between our parents that she and I might eventually marry. It never became anything official, nothing either of us ever agreed to personally, but it's the kind of expectation that lingers in certain rooms, whether we want it to or not." Elena absorbed this information slowly, pieces of the previous night's tension finally clicking into place. "And now I've shown up in Ivory, and apparently ruined those particular plans." "Apparently," Damien agreed, his jaw tightening slightly. "I need you to know, whatever she says tonight, whatever she implies, none of it reflects how I actually feel about this situation, or about you." Elena nodded slowly, steadying herself for whatever awaited them at the Castellano estate, aware that tonight's dinner promised to be far more complicated than the sprawling anonymous crowd of the winter ball had been. Tonight, there would be no hiding in a sea of strangers. Tonight, she would be facing the people who knew Damien best, under far closer, far more dangerous scrutiny than any she had faced so far. The Castellano family dining room was smaller than the ballroom, though no less grand, with a long table set beneath an antique chandelier, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors watching from gilded frames along the walls. 30 places had been set, and by the time Elena and Damien arrived, most of the seats were already filled with relatives Elena had only briefly glimpsed at the ball, their faces now sharpened by curiosity, rather than the soft distraction of dance and champagne. Sophia greeted them warmly at the door, kissing Elena on both cheeks, as though they were old friends, rather than two people who had known each other for exactly one strange, chaotic evening. "You came," she said, beaming. "I worried Damien might have frightened you off already." "He's been on his best behavior," Elena said, forcing lightness into her voice, despite the nerves fluttering in her stomach. "Good," Sophia said, patting her arm. "Come, sit, you're beside me tonight. I want to hear everything about your shop." Elena allowed herself to be led to a seat near the head of the table, Damien settling in beside her a moment later, his hand finding hers briefly beneath the tablecloth in a small, steadying gesture that helped calm her racing pulse. Across the table, she spotted Priya, seated between two older women Elena didn't recognize, her expression carefully neutral, though her sharp eyes tracked every movement Elena and Damien made. Dinner began with polite conversation, questions about Elena's shop that she answered honestly and in detail, grateful for a topic she actually knew well enough to discuss without fear of misstep. Sophia listened with genuine interest, asking about her favorite flowers, her busiest seasons, the story behind how she had come to own the shop in the first place. Elena found herself relaxing slightly, the warmth of Sophia's attention easing some of the tension coiled in her shoulders. It was during the second course that Priya finally spoke up, her voice carrying easily down the length of the table, pleasant on the surface, but edged with something sharper beneath. "It's such an interesting story," Priya said, setting down her wine glass with deliberate precision. "A florist, wearing ivory, at the one event where the color actually means something. What are the odds?" The table quieted slightly, several heads turning with polite curiosity. Elena felt Damien tense beside her, but before he could respond, she set down her own fork and met Priya's gaze directly, refusing to let the challenge go unanswered. "Fairly low odds, I'd imagine," Elena said evenly. "I didn't grow up in circles where ball gown colors carried hidden meanings. Where I'm from, ivory just means the boutique happened to have my size in stock." A few soft chuckles rippled around the table, and Elena caught Lucia hiding a smile behind her wine glass. Priya's expression flickered, irritation breaking briefly through her composed mask before she smoothed it away. "How fortunate for you, then," Priya said smoothly, "that fate works in such convenient ways." "Priya," Sophia said, her tone carrying a gentle but unmistakable warning. "Elena is our guest tonight." "Of course," Priya said, inclining her head slightly, though her eyes remained fixed on Elena a moment longer than necessary, before she returned her attention to her plate. The conversation moved on, but Elena felt the tension humming beneath the surface for the remainder of dinner. Every polite question from other relatives carrying a faint undercurrent of scrutiny, every glance from Priya's direction sharp enough to feel through the length of the table. She kept her composure, drawing on years of practice managing difficult clients and demanding wedding parties, answering every question with careful honesty wherever possible, and gentle deflection where honesty would have revealed too much. By the time dessert arrived, a rich chocolate torte that Elena barely tasted through her lingering nerves, she felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness, and everything to do with the constant vigilance of performing a role she had never trained for. Beside her, Damien seemed to sense her fatigue, his hand finding hers again beneath the table, a silent question asking if she was all right. She squeezed his hand once in response, a small, private reassurance that felt more genuine than she expected, given the circumstances that had brought them together in the first place. After dinner, as the family began to disperse into smaller groups throughout the sprawling estate, Sophia pulled Elena aside near a large window overlooking the snow-covered gardens, her expression turning thoughtful and unexpectedly tender. You handled Priya beautifully tonight, Sophia said quietly. Better than most would have. She doesn't seem to like me very much, Elena admitted. She doesn't like change, Sophia corrected gently. For years, she assumed a certain future was hers, simply because it had always been expected. It is not your fault that expectations do not always match reality, dear girl. Do not let her make you feel small for arriving somewhere she believed she was owed. Elena absorbed this advice quietly, guilt twisting uncomfortably in her chest at the trust Sophia continued to place in her. Trust built entirely on a misunderstanding, Elena still hadn't found the courage to correct. She thought of her promised 6-week timeline, of the careful conditions she had negotiated with Damien, and wondered, not for the first time, whether any version of the truth could emerge from this situation without causing exactly the kind of heartbreak she had agreed to help prevent. Sophia, Elena began carefully, I want you to know that whatever happens between Damien and me, I care about your happiness. I don't want to see you hurt. Sophia studied her for a long moment, something knowing flickering behind her sharp eyes, as though she sensed more beneath Elena's words than Elena had intended to reveal. I appreciate that, Sophia said finally, more than you know. But let me offer you a piece of advice, from someone who has lived through far more heartbreak than any winter ball could inflict. Whatever happens between you and my grandson, real or otherwise, the truth always finds its way to the surface eventually. It is far kinder, in the end, to let it rise gently than to let it break through all at once. Elena's breath caught, uncertain whether Sophia's words carried a hidden warning or simply the wisdom of a woman who had witnessed enough of life's complications to recognize one unfolding in front of her. Before she could ask, Damien appeared at her side once more, offering her coat with a gentle smile that suggested the evening, at least for tonight, had reached its natural end. Ready to go? He asked. Elena nodded, saying her goodbyes to Sophia with a warmth that felt entirely genuine despite the lie tangled beneath it, and allowed Damien to walk her out through the grand front doors into the cold night air, snow still falling softly over the estate's silent gardens. That went better than I expected, Damien said, once they were settled in the car, pulling away from the glowing house. Aside from Priya's little performance at dinner. Your grandmother is remarkable, Elena said quietly, still turning over Sophia's parting words in her mind. I think she might know more than we're giving her credit for. Damien glanced at her sharply. What do you mean? I don't know exactly, Elena admitted. Just something in the way she talks. Like she's waiting for something she already suspects is coming. Damien was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the soft hum of the car's engine and the gentle patter of snow against the windshield. She's sharper than any of us give her credit for, he said finally. It wouldn't surprise me if she already suspects something isn't quite as simple as it appears. Then why does she keep pushing us together? Dinners? Introductions? All of it? Because, Damien said slowly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, though his voice carried something softer, more uncertain than she had heard from him before. I think some part of her wants this to be real, regardless of how it started. And if I'm being honest with myself, Elena, some part of me is beginning to want that too. Elena said nothing, the weight of his admission settling heavily in the quiet space between them, snow falling steadily outside the windows as the car carried them further from the golden lights of the estate and deeper into a night that suddenly felt far more uncertain and far more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart than she had ever intended it to become. 2 weeks passed in a strange, comfortable rhythm neither Elena nor Damien had quite anticipated. What began as scheduled appearances, careful and calculated, gradually softened into something less rehearsed. Damien started stopping by the flower shop in the mornings before work, no longer needing an excuse, bringing coffee that he now knew she took with cream and no sugar. Elena found herself looking forward to the sound of the brass bell above her door, in a way that had nothing to do with the arrangement they had made. It was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, while Elena was elbow-deep in a delivery of fresh ranunculus, that Damien appeared unannounced, his tie loosened, and his expression carrying none of the composed control she had grown used to seeing in public. Bad day? Elena asked, setting down her shears. My father wants me to take over negotiations for a merger he's been avoiding for months, Damien said, sinking into one of the mismatched chairs by the window. Everyone assumes I'll simply say yes, the way I always do, and fold myself into whatever shape the business requires. Elena wiped her hands on her apron and sat across from him, recognizing the particular exhaustion in his voice. The same weariness she sometimes felt after a wedding client changed her mind about centerpieces for the fourth time in a single week. "Do you want to say yes?" "I don't know anymore," Damien admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I used to think I did. I used to think the business was simply who I was supposed to become, the same way the sun comes up every morning without anyone asking its opinion. But lately, I've started wondering what I might have chosen, if anyone had actually asked." "What would you have chosen?" Elena asked gently. Damien was quiet for a long moment, watching her arrange stems into a simple, elegant vase, her hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who had built something entirely her own from nothing. "Something like this, maybe," he said finally. "Something that felt like it belonged to me, rather than something inherited before I was even born." Elena set down the vase, meeting his eyes with a warmth she no longer bothered trying to hide. "It's not too late to figure that out," she said. "You're what, 32? That's not exactly ancient history." 33, Damien corrected, a small smile finally breaking through his tiredness. "And you make it sound so simple." "I'm not saying it's simple," Elena said. "I'm saying it's possible. Those aren't the same thing." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, the shop quiet, except for the soft hum of the cooler and the occasional chime of the door as customers came and went. Elena found herself stealing glances at him throughout the afternoon, noting the way his shoulders gradually relaxed the longer he stayed, the way his laugh, when she finally coaxed it out of him over a shared joke about her wholesale supplier's terrible taste in music, sounded lighter and more genuine than anything she had heard from him at the ball or the dinner. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, nearly 3 weeks into their arrangement, that Elena first admitted to herself, in the privacy of her own thoughts, that whatever she felt for Damien Castellano had stopped being pretend somewhere along the way, though she had no idea exactly when the shift had happened. The realization frightened her more than the ball itself had. At least the ball had been a single, contained mistake, something with a clear beginning and, she had assumed, an equally clear ending. This was different. This was the slow, quiet accumulation of shared coffee and shared laughter, of late afternoon conversations that stretched longer than either of them intended, of a growing awareness that she had started planning her days around the sound of his voice. She said nothing of this to Damien, uncertain how to voice a feeling that complicated everything about their careful, businesslike arrangement, and equally uncertain whether he felt anything similar in return. Instead, she threw herself into work, accepting a large order for a corporate gala that kept her busy late into several evenings, grateful for the distraction, even as she found herself checking her phone more often than she wanted to admit, hoping for a message that had nothing to do with their public appearances together. The message, when it finally came, was not the one she expected. It arrived on a Thursday evening, just as Elena was closing the shop for the night, her phone buzzing against the work table, where she had left it, while sweeping fallen petals from the floor. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach drop at the unfamiliar number, the message itself sending a cold jolt of alarm through her chest. "I know your little arrangement isn't real. Meet me tomorrow at the cafe on Hollis Street, 10 in the morning, or I start telling people the truth. Come alone." Elena read the message 3 times, her pulse hammering, before setting the phone down with trembling hands. There was no name attached, but she didn't need one to guess who had sent it. She thought of Priya's cold, calculating stare across the dinner table, the sharp edge beneath her polite conversation, and felt certain, with a dread that settled heavy in her stomach, exactly who was threatening to unravel everything she and Damien had so carefully built. She sat alone in her darkened shop for a long time that evening, staring at the message, weighing whether to tell Damien immediately or to handle the confrontation herself first, to protect him from a fight that had, in some strange way, become entirely her own to face. She thought of Sophia's parting words at the dinner, about truth finding its way to the surface eventually, and wondered, with mounting unease, whether tomorrow's meeting would mark the beginning of that inevitable unraveling. Finally, she picked up her phone again, not to call Damien, but to type a single, steady reply to the unknown number. "I'll be there." She set the phone down, turned off the shop lights, and locked the door behind her, stepping out into the cold evening air, with a heavy sense that whatever fragile peace she had built over the past 3 weeks was about to be tested in ways she had never anticipated when she first borrowed a stranger's ivory dress on the worst and strangest night of her ordinary life. That night, sleep came slowly and unevenly, Elena's mind cycling through every possible version of tomorrow's confrontation, every accusation Priya might level against her, every consequence that might follow if the truth spilled out before she and Damien had found a gentler way to reveal it. She thought of Sophia's fragile heart, of Damien's careful, guarded trust, of her own small shop, and the reputation she had spent years building, all of it suddenly feeling precarious, in a way it hadn't since the moment she first walked through the Castellano estate's grand front doors. By the time morning arrived, gray and overcast, Elena had made her decision. She would meet Priya alone, hear whatever accusation or demand awaited her, and handle it with the same steady composure she had relied on throughout every difficult moment of the past 3 weeks. She dressed carefully, chose her words in advance as best she could, and drove to the cafe on Hollis Street, with her hands steady on the wheel despite the anxious churn in her stomach. Priya was already seated when Elena arrived, a cup of black coffee untouched in front of her, her expression sharp and unreadable, as Elena slid into the seat across from her. "You came," Priya said, echoing Sophia's words from weeks earlier, though the warmth Sophia had carried was entirely absent from Priya's cool, measuring tone. "You said you'd tell people the truth if I didn't," Elena said, keeping her voice steady, despite the pounding of her heart. "I'm not interested in games. What do you want?" Priya studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind her sharp eyes that Elena couldn't quite interpret, before she finally leaned back in her chair and folded her hands on the table between them. "I want to know exactly what you're planning to do," Priya said, "before you break that old woman's heart." Elena blinked, thrown off balance by the question, so different from the accusation she had braced herself for. "I'm not planning to break anyone's heart," she said carefully. "That's the last thing I want." "And yet," Priya said, "you've been playing a role for 3 weeks now, letting an entire family believe in something that isn't true. What happens when the 6 weeks end, Elena? What happens when Damien finally tells his grandmother the truth, and she realizes the granddaughter she's already grown to love was never real at all?" The question landed like a blow, hitting far closer to Elena's own private fears than she wanted to admit. "How do you know about the 6 weeks?" she asked instead, buying herself time to steady her voice. "Damien and I grew up together," Priya said. "We may not have ended up where our families once hoped, but I still know him well enough to recognize when he's improvising his way through a crisis. It wasn't difficult to guess the shape of your arrangement, even before I found the text message he accidentally left open on his phone at dinner last week." Elena absorbed this information slowly, understanding now the source of Priya's sharp, calculating stares throughout the family dinner. Whatever fury she had assumed was simple jealousy, carried, it seemed, a more complicated undercurrent than she had initially credited. "I never meant to hurt Sophia," Elena said finally, honesty winning out over caution. "This started as a mistake, a genuine misunderstanding about a dress I borrowed at the last minute. Damien and I agreed to buy some time, to protect her while he found a way to explain things gently. I know that sounds complicated and probably reckless, but it wasn't meant to be cruel." Priya's expression softened slightly, some of the sharp edges in her posture easing as she studied Elena across the table. "I believe you," she said, surprising Elena considerably. "Which is precisely why I'm concerned. Sophia has already told half our family friends that Damien is finally settling down. She's been happier these past 3 weeks than I've seen her in years. If this ends the way these arrangements usually do, quietly, with some vague excuse about timing not being right, it will devastate her far more than if the truth simply comes out now, honestly and completely." "What are you suggesting?" Elena asked warily. "I'm suggesting you stop hiding behind convenient timelines and figure out what you actually want," Priya said bluntly. "Either commit to seeing where this genuinely goes with Damien, or end it now, cleanly, before Sophia's hope grows too large to survive the disappointment." Elena sat back, stunned by the directness of Priya's assessment, uncertain whether to feel grateful for the honesty or unsettled by how easily this woman, practically a stranger, had seen through to the heart of Elena's own private uncertainty. "You said you wanted to talk about protecting Sophia," Elena said slowly. "But this sounds like something else entirely. This sounds personal." Priya's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first genuine crack Elena had seen in her composed exterior since sitting down. "Perhaps it is," Priya admitted after a long pause. "I spent years assuming a future with Damien that never materialized, not because either of us actively chose it, but because neither of us ever bothered to examine whether it was something we truly wanted. Watching you with him at dinner, watching the way he actually looks at you, I recognized something I never had with him myself, not in all those years of quiet family expectation." Elena felt a wave of unexpected sympathy wash over her, understanding, for the first time, the true source of Priya's cold hostility at the ball. It wasn't simple jealousy over losing a prize she believed she was owed. It was the quiet grief of recognizing, perhaps for the first time, exactly what she herself had never experienced. "I'm sorry," Elena said softly. "I know that's probably not what you want to hear from me." "It's not," Priya admitted, a wry, humorless smile touching her mouth. "But it's honest, and I suppose I asked for honesty when I sent that message last night. I'm not here to threaten you, Elena. Whatever my message might have implied, I'm here because I care about Sophia's happiness, genuinely, and because some strange, stubborn part of me still cares what happens to Damien, even now." "So what do you want me to do?" Elena asked. "Figure out the truth," Priya said simply. "Not the truth about the dress, or the arrangement, or the 6-week timeline. The truth about what you actually feel for him. Because if it's real, Elena, then stop hiding it behind careful conditions and cautious timelines, and let it become something worth Sophia's hope. And if it isn't real, if this is simply a business arrangement that's grown too comfortable for its own good, then end it now, before someone gets hurt far worse than a bruised pride at a winter ball." Elena sat with the weight of Priya's words long after their meeting ended, driving back to her shop in a daze, Priya's challenge echoing in her mind, alongside her own quiet, private admission from 3 weeks of stolen coffee mornings and easy laughter. She thought of the way Damien's shoulders relaxed the moment he stepped through her shop door, the way his voice softened when he spoke about wanting something that felt entirely his own, the way her own heart had begun, without her permission, to measure its days by the sound of his laughter, rather than the ticking clock of their carefully negotiated 6 weeks. She arrived at her shop just as Damien's car pulled up outside, and she realized, watching him step out with his usual composed grace, that she could no longer pretend the uncertainty Priya had named didn't exist within her own chest. Whatever this had started as, whatever careful arrangement had brought them together beneath golden ballroom chandeliers, it had grown into something Elena could no longer categorize as pretend, and the realization terrified her exactly as much as it filled her with a fragile, unexpected hope. "You look like you've had a strange morning," Damien said, as she unlocked the shop door, his easy smile faltering slightly at whatever he read in her expression. "I met with Priya," Elena admitted, deciding, in that moment, that honesty was the only path forward that made any sense. "She knows about our arrangement, Damien. She's known for a while." Damien's expression shifted rapidly through surprise, alarm, and finally, a kind of resigned understanding. "What did she say?" "She asked me what I actually want," Elena said quietly, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "And I think, for the first time since that ridiculous ball, I actually know the answer." Damien went very still, his dark eyes searching her face, as though trying to read the answer before she gave it. The quiet shop around them seemed to hold its breath, buckets of fresh stems, and the soft hum of the cooler, the only witnesses to a moment that felt, to Elena, far larger than the small, ordinary space could contain. "And what is the answer?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the brass bell above the door chimed sharply, and both of them turned to see Oliver rushing in, breathless and wide-eyed, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. "Elena, you need to see this," he said, holding the screen out toward her, his voice shaking with an urgency that immediately chased away every soft, uncertain feeling that had been building in the quiet shop moments before. "It's already everywhere online. Someone posted photos from the ball, and now there's a whole story about who you really are, and it's not good." Elena's stomach dropped as she took the phone, Damien moving to look over her shoulder, both of them staring in growing horror at a headline splashed across a popular gossip website, photographs from the winter ball arranged beneath a title that promised, in bold, sensational letters, to reveal the truth behind the mysterious woman in Ivory. Whatever fragile private answer Elena had been ready to give Damien moments earlier suddenly felt like the least of their problems, as the quiet, careful world they had built over the past 3 weeks threatened to collapse entirely under the sudden, unwelcome glare of public attention. The article had already gathered several thousand shares by the time Elena finished reading it, her hands trembling as she scrolled through paragraph after paragraph of speculation dressed up as fact. It claimed, citing an unnamed source close to the family, that the woman photographed at the Castellano winter ball was not actually engaged to Damien at all, but rather a hired companion, brought in to quiet growing rumors about the family's declining fortune and Damien's supposed reluctance to settle down. "This is insane," Elena said, handing the phone back to Oliver with shaking hands. "None of this is true. Where would they even get this idea?" "It doesn't matter if it's true," Damien said grimly, already pulling out his own phone, scrolling through what appeared to be a flood of messages and missed calls. "It matters that my grandmother is going to see this within the hour, if she hasn't already." As if summoned by his words, his phone began ringing, Sophia's name flashing across the screen. Damien answered immediately, his expression tightening as he listened to whatever his grandmother said on the other end, his knuckles white around the phone. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said finally, ending the call and turning to Elena with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, a mixture of fear and fierce determination that made her chest ache with sympathy. "She wants to see us, both of us, now." "What did she say?" Elena asked, already reaching for her coat. "She didn't sound angry," Damien said slowly, as though trying to make sense of it himself. "She sounded scared. I've never heard my grandmother sound scared before, not once in my entire life." They drove to the Castellano estate in tense silence, Elena's mind racing through every possible way the conversation might unfold, every version of the truth she might finally be forced to reveal. She thought of Priya's challenge from that morning, of her own half-formed answer that had been interrupted before she could give it, and wondered whether fate itself had decided the timeline for their careful arrangement had run its course far sooner than either of them had planned. Sophia was waiting for them in the estate's smaller sitting room when they arrived, seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, a tablet resting on her lap displaying the same article Elena had read in her shop less than an hour earlier. Her face, usually so animated and warm, looked pale and drawn in the firelight, older somehow than Elena had ever seen her. "Sit," Sophia said quietly, gesturing to the chairs across from her. "Both of you." They sat, Elena's heart hammering so loudly she was certain the older woman could hear it. Sophia set the tablet aside and studied them both for a long, silent moment, her sharp eyes moving between Elena's anxious face and Damien's carefully controlled expression. "I have known for some time that something about your story didn't quite add up," Sophia said finally, her voice steady, despite the visible tremor in her hands. "I am old, not foolish. I have watched my grandson fall in love exactly once before, many years ago, and I remember precisely what it looked like on his face. What I have seen these past 3 weeks has looked similar, but not identical. There has always been something careful beneath it, something guarded, as though you were both walking across ice you weren't entirely certain would hold your weight." Elena's breath caught, guilt and relief warring painfully in her chest, at finally hearing the truth spoken aloud, even secondhand through Sophia's careful observation. Beside her, Damien had gone very still, his hand finding hers on the cushion between them, though whether for his own comfort or hers, Elena couldn't say. "Nana," Damien began, "I need to explain." "I don't need an explanation of the mistake," Sophia interrupted gently. "I have already guessed most of it myself. A wrong dress, an old tradition, a room full of witnesses before either of you had time to correct the misunderstanding. What I need to understand, Damien, is why you chose to let it continue for 3 weeks, rather than telling me the truth immediately." Damien's jaw tightened, and Elena watched him wrestle visibly with the answer, torn between protecting his grandmother's feelings and finally giving her the honesty she deserved. "Because I was afraid," he admitted finally, his voice rougher than Elena had ever heard it. "Your doctor called father last month with concerns about your heart. I didn't want to be the reason you had another difficult night, especially not over something as foolish as a misunderstood dress." Sophia's expression softened, though sadness lingered beneath the tenderness now visible in her eyes. "Oh, my darling boy," she said quietly, "do you truly believe I am so fragile that the truth itself might break me?" I have survived far worse in this life than a small, honest disappointment. What breaks a heart, Damien, is not truth. It is being protected from truth, by people who claim to love you, as though love and honesty cannot exist in the same room together. The words landed heavily in the quiet sitting room, firelight flickering across three faces, caught somewhere between guilt, relief, and a fragile, uncertain hope that the truth, once finally spoken, might not be as destructive as they had all feared. "I'm sorry," Elena said quietly, finally finding her voice. "I should have corrected the misunderstanding the very first night. I let it continue, because your kindness, your welcome, felt too precious to shatter with a single sentence. That was selfish of me, and I'm truly sorry for any pain this deception has caused you." Sophia turned her sharp, assessing gaze toward Elena, studying her for a long moment before something like genuine warmth returned to her expression. "You mistake selfishness for kindness, dear girl," she said. "What you did was foolish, yes, but it was not cruel. I have watched you these past 3 weeks. Watched the way you speak to my staff with genuine respect, the way you handled Priya's sharp tongue with grace rather than retaliation, the way my grandson's shoulders ease the moment you enter a room. Whatever began as a mistake has clearly grown into something neither of you entirely anticipated." "What happens now?" Damien asked quietly. "With the article? With everything?" Sophia's expression turned businesslike, some of her usual sharp authority returning to her posture as she straightened in her chair. "Now," she said, "we handle the article the way our family has always handled public speculation, with dignity and a carefully worded statement that neither confirms nor denies anything the reporters do not deserve to know. But that is a separate matter from the truth between the two of you, which I suspect neither of you has fully examined yet. Not honestly, not without the pressure of an audience or a timeline forcing your hand." She looked between them, her expression gentling once more, tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her sharp eyes. "So I will ask you both a simple question, and I want an honest answer, not a performance meant to spare my feelings. Do you actually care for each other, or has this entire arrangement simply been a kindness extended to an old woman's foolish hopes?" Elena turned to look at Damien, finding him already watching her, his dark eyes carrying none of the careful composure she had grown used to seeing in public, only a raw, uncertain honesty that mirrored exactly what she felt building in her own chest. "I care for him," Elena said quietly, the words emerging with a certainty that surprised her, even as her heart pounded with the vulnerability of finally speaking them aloud. "More than I expected to, more than I think either of us planned for when this began. That part was never a lie, Sophia, even when everything else about our arrangement was." Damien's hand tightened around hers, and when he spoke, his voice carried a rough sincerity that made Elena's breath catch entirely. "I care for her too," he said, looking not at his grandmother, but directly at Elena, as though the words were meant for her, far more than for the woman watching them both, with tears now falling freely down her weathered cheeks. "I think I have for weeks now, longer than I've been willing to admit, even to myself." Sophia let out a soft, watery laugh, pressing a trembling hand to her chest. "Well," she said, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, "it seems this old family tradition was not so wrong after all, even if the circumstances surrounding it were considerably more complicated than any of us anticipated." Relief flooded through Elena so powerfully that she felt momentarily dizzy with it, the weight of 3 weeks of careful deception finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. But even as hope bloomed unexpectedly in her chest, she knew the article still loomed unresolved beyond the estate's quiet walls, and somewhere out there, Priya's warning about protecting Sophia's heart had already, it seemed, come dangerously close to proving prophetic, in ways none of them had fully anticipated. Sophia's relief lasted only a few minutes before practical concerns reasserted themselves, the older woman's sharp mind already turning toward damage control, with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades navigating public scrutiny. She summoned the family's longtime publicist, a brisk, no-nonsense woman named Farah who arrived within the hour, laptop already open, scanning through the spreading article with a practiced, unbothered eye. "It's not as bad as it could be," Farah announced, settling into a chair near the fireplace, without waiting for an invitation. "The source is anonymous and unverified. Most legitimate outlets haven't picked it up yet. If we move quickly, We can control the narrative before it hardens into something harder to walk back. What do you suggest? Damien asked, his arm now resting comfortably along the back of the sofa behind Elena, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her, steady and reassuring after the emotional weight of the past hour. A joint statement, Farah said, already typing. Simple, warm, and boring. Boring is our friend here. We confirm the relationship without confirming or denying the engagement rumor specifically, express gratitude for the well wishes, and request privacy. No details about how you met. No mention of the ball at all, if we can help it. Give them nothing dramatic to chew on, and the story dies within a week. Elena listened to this exchange with a strange sense of unreality, the practical machinery of wealth and reputation management unfolding around her in a way she had never witnessed up close before. She thought of her own small shop, her ordinary life of flower deliveries and wedding orders, and marveled briefly at how far removed this world was from anything she had known before that single, fateful ball. Elena, Sophia said gently, drawing her attention back to the room. How do you feel about a photograph? Something simple, taken here at the estate, showing the two of you together, relaxed and genuine. It tends to do more to quiet speculation than any written statement possibly could. Elena glanced at Damien, finding him watching her with a question in his eyes, silently asking whether she was truly ready for this, for a public step that would make whatever existed between them undeniably real in the eyes of the world, not just within the careful privacy of Sophia's sitting room. I think that's a good idea, Elena said finally, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. As long as it's honest, I don't want to perform anything anymore. I'm tired of performing. Then let's not perform, Damien said quietly, squeezing her hand. Let's just be exactly what we actually are. Farah arranged for a photographer within the hour, and Elena found herself standing in the estate's snow-dusted garden as the winter afternoon light slanted gold and soft through bare tree branches. Damien's arm wrapped naturally around her waist. No careful choreography required this time, only the simple, unguarded comfort of two people who had finally stopped pretending. The photographer captured perhaps a dozen images before declaring satisfaction, and Elena felt, for the first time since that chaotic first night, a genuine lightness settle over her, as though the truth, once finally spoken, had lifted a weight she hadn't fully realized she was carrying. The statement went out that evening, brief and warm, exactly as Farah had promised, accompanied by a single photograph of Elena and Damien, standing close together in the winter garden, both of them smiling, in a way that required no performance at all. Elena watched from her apartment as the response unfolded online, tentative at first, then gradually warming, as commenters responded to the obvious, unforced affection, visible in the photograph, rather than the sensational speculation of the earlier article. Grace called within the hour, practically shouting with excitement as she scrolled through the growing wave of positive comments. You're trending, she announced. People are calling you the most genuine couple they've seen from that family in years. Elena, this is actually working. It's not a strategy, Grace, Elena said, though she couldn't fully suppress her own relieved laughter. It's just true, finally. Well, true looks good on you, Grace said warmly. I'm happy for you, Elena. Really, whatever this started as, it clearly isn't pretend anymore. Elena thanked her sister and ended the call, sinking back into her couch with a tired, grateful exhale, the events of the day finally catching up with her exhausted body. Her phone buzzed once more almost immediately, and she smiled instinctively, before even checking the screen, already certain who it would be. Damien's message was simple, just 3 words, that carried more weight than any grand declaration might have managed after the chaos of the day they had both survived together. Dinner tomorrow? Just us. Elena typed back her agreement without hesitation, something settling comfortably into place in her chest that felt, for the first time since she had accidentally worn the wrong dress to the wrong ball, entirely and uncomplicatedly right. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever remained of Priya's warnings or the lingering questions about the article's original anonymous source, Elena allowed herself, for one quiet evening, to simply feel grateful for the strange, impossible path that had led her here. She did not know yet that the anonymous source behind the article had not been Priya at all, and that the true origin of the leak was still waiting, patient and calculating, for a far more damaging moment to reveal itself fully. Across the city, In an office far less grand than the Castellano estate, a man named Victor Hale closed his laptop with a quiet, satisfied smile. The failed article nothing more than a preliminary test, a small stone thrown to measure the depth of the water, before something far heavier followed behind it. He had watched the family's swift, polished response with professional interest, noting exactly how they moved to control damage, information he intended to put to careful use when the timing suited his purposes far better than a single anonymous tip ever could. He opened a new document and began typing notes, patient and methodical, aware that the real story he was building required far more than gossip about a mismatched dress. It required proof, documentation, something no publicist's careful statement could simply explain away, and he had every intention of finding exactly that, however long it took him to uncover it. Dinner the following evening was nothing like the grand, chandelier-lit gatherings of the past few weeks. Damien had booked a small, quiet restaurant tucked along the harbor, the kind of place with candle-lit tables and no photographers waiting outside, and Elena felt herself relax the moment they stepped through the door, grateful for an evening that finally belonged to just the two of them. No family, no reporters, no ancient traditions to navigate, Damien said, pulling out her chair with a small, teasing smile. Just dinner. I thought we deserved one normal evening, after everything. I'll take it, Elena said, settling into her seat with a genuine laugh, the tension of the past weeks finally beginning to ease from her shoulders. Though I should warn you, my idea of a normal evening usually involves takeout and reruns of old cooking shows. This is already exceeding expectations. I can work with that, Damien said, his eyes warm in the candlelight. Though I make no promises about matching the quality of your usual takeout. They talked for hours over dinner, conversation flowing easily between them, in a way it hadn't quite managed during their earlier, more guarded weeks of careful public performance. Elena told him about her mother, about the long nights of cleaning office buildings that had funded her early flower arranging classes, about the particular pride she felt every time a nervous bride walked into her shop and left with exactly the arrangement she hadn't known she wanted. Damien, in turn, spoke more openly than he had before about his mother's illness years earlier, about the quiet grief that still lingered beneath his family's polished exterior, about the strange loneliness of growing up, expected to inherit everything, and choose nothing for himself. I used to think love was something that happened to other people, Damien admitted quietly, turning his wineglass slowly between his fingers. Something that fit neatly into other families, ones without quite so many expectations weighing down every decision. I never expected it to arrive because of a borrowed dress and a ridiculous old tradition. Life has a strange sense of humor sometimes, Elena said softly, reaching across the table to cover his hand with hers. I'm grateful for it, Damien said, turning his hand to lace his fingers through hers. Even the ridiculous parts. Especially the ridiculous parts, honestly. Walking back to the car after dinner, snow drifting lightly through the streetlights along the harbor, Damien stopped suddenly, turning to face her with an expression more serious than any he had worn all evening. Elena, he said, I know things between us started in the strangest possible way. I know we still have complications to navigate. My family, the business, whatever remains of that article's fallout. But I want you to know that none of that changes how I feel about you. Whatever happens next, I want to face it honestly. Together. Not because of an old tradition or a misunderstood dress, but because I actually choose you. Elena felt tears gather, unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, the sincerity in his voice settling something warm and certain deep in her chest. I choose you too, she said quietly, for exactly the same reasons. He kissed her then, gentle and unhurried beneath the falling snow, and Elena felt, for the first time since that chaotic winter ball, that whatever came next, she was ready to face it without fear, standing beside a man who had somehow, through the strangest possible circumstances, become the truest, steadiest thing in her ordinary, hard-working life. The weeks that followed carried a new, easier rhythm between them. Public appearances no longer feeling like careful performances, but simply extensions of a relationship that had, at last, become entirely genuine. Sophia's health, freed from the weight of worry that had shadowed her in the weeks before the truth emerged, seemed to improve steadily, her energy and sharp wit returning in full force during family gatherings that Elena now attended without a trace of the anxious guilt that had once accompanied every dinner. Even Priya, surprisingly, softened toward her over the following weeks, the two women finding an unlikely, cautious friendship built on the honesty of their earlier confrontation. Priya began stopping by the flower shop occasionally, initially under the guise of ordering arrangements for various family events, though Elena suspected the true purpose had more to do with genuine curiosity about the woman who had unknowingly upended her own long-held expectations. "I owe you an apology," Priya admitted one afternoon, examining a bucket of fresh peonies while Elena worked nearby, "for how I treated you at the ball, and for the message I sent you afterward. I let my own disappointment color how I saw you, before I actually took the time to know you." "You don't owe me anything," Elena said honestly. "If anything, that conversation at the cafe pushed me toward admitting something I might have kept avoiding otherwise. I should be thanking you, not accepting an apology." Priya smiled, something genuine and unguarded crossing her sharp features, for perhaps the first time since Elena had met her. "Perhaps we can call it even then," she said, "and perhaps, in time, actual friends." Elena found herself smiling at the thought, another small, unexpected gift among the many strange, wonderful surprises this whole impossible situation had brought into her carefully ordinary life. It was nearly 2 months after the ball, on a quiet Sunday afternoon while Elena was restocking her shop's cooler, that her phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number, the second such message she had received since this entire journey began. Her stomach tightened instinctively as she opened it, memories of Priya's earlier warning message flashing uncomfortably through her mind. But this message carried a very different, far more dangerous tone entirely. "I have documents proving your entire relationship was staged for financial gain. Talk to me before I go public, or the story runs exactly the way I choose to tell it." Elena read the message twice, her hands growing cold despite the warmth of the shop around her, and realized, with a sinking dread, that whatever peace she and Damien had finally found together was about to be tested in a far more serious way than a jealous family friend's momentary anger ever could have managed. Elena called Damien immediately, her voice tight with barely controlled alarm. As she read the message aloud to him over the phone, she heard him exhale slowly on the other end, the sound of shuffling papers, suggesting he had been in the middle of work when her call interrupted him. "Send me the number," he said, his tone shifting quickly into the same careful, controlled mode she had witnessed the day of the first article. "I'll have Farah trace it immediately. In the meantime, don't respond to anything. Don't confirm, don't deny, don't engage at all." "Damien, what documents could they possibly have?" Elena asked, pacing anxiously between her work table and the front window of her shop. "There's nothing to find. Our relationship isn't staged, not anymore. Whatever this is, it's not going to hold up under any real scrutiny." "I know," Damien said, though something in his voice carried a hesitation that made Elena's stomach twist further. "But there might be something they could twist. Records of payments I mentioned in the beginning, for your time during those first few weeks. If someone got hold of bank statements, financial records, it could look exactly like the accusation they're making, even though the truth behind it is far more complicated than a simple transaction." Elena's breath caught, the memory of Damien's initial offer to compensate her, the careful conditions she had negotiated over the phone weeks ago, suddenly feeling far more damning than she had considered at the time. Would that be enough to actually prove something happened for money? "It depends on who's telling the story, and how they choose to frame it," Damien admitted grimly. "I'll come to your shop as soon as I can get away. We'll figure this out together, exactly like we did with the last article." He arrived within the hour, his expression carrying a tension Elena hadn't seen from him since the earliest, most uncertain days of their arrangement. He held his phone out to her, Farah already on speaker, her brisk voice carrying clearly through the quiet shop. "The number traces back to a burner account, untraceable through normal channels," Farah reported. "But I did some digging into recent activity around your family's business dealings, Damien, and I found something concerning. A financial analyst named Victor Hale left your father's firm about 6 months ago, under circumstances that were never fully explained publicly. He's been freelancing as an investigative journalist since then, mostly small pieces, nothing significant until now. Given his previous access to internal records, he's exactly the kind of person who might have obtained sensitive financial information before his departure." Elena felt a fresh wave of dread wash over her at this revelation. the pieces clicking together into a far more calculated threat than either of them had initially anticipated. "Why would he target us specifically?" she asked. "What does he actually gain from exposing something that isn't even entirely true?" "Money, most likely," Farah said bluntly. "Scandal sells, especially scandal involving families as prominent as yours, Damien. If he's built a story around financial impropriety, it could be worth a significant payout from any number of outlets eager for exclusive access." "Can we stop him?" Damien asked. "Legally or otherwise?" "We can try," Farah said, though her tone carried little optimism. "But if he genuinely has documentation, even documentation that misrepresents the full truth, it will be difficult to suppress entirely. Our best strategy is likely getting ahead of the story ourselves, controlling the narrative before he has the chance to frame it in the worst possible light." The call ended shortly after, leaving Elena and Damien standing together in the quiet shop, the weight of this new threat settling heavily between them. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the space. Memories of her own hard-earned reputation, built carefully over years of honest work, now hanging precariously in the balance because of a decision she had made weeks earlier, out of simple financial necessity. "I never should have agreed to be paid," Elena said quietly, more to herself than to Damien. "I knew it complicated things, even back then. I just needed the money too badly to think it through properly." "This isn't your fault," Damien said firmly, moving closer to take her hands in his. "I offered the payment. I'm the one who insisted on it, back when I was thinking only about protecting my grandmother, not about how it might look later if someone chose to weaponize it against us." "It doesn't matter whose fault it is," Elena said, pulling her hands free, pacing anxiously once more, as her mind raced through worst-case scenarios. "If this goes public, the way he's threatening, everyone will believe exactly what that first article implied, except now, with supposed proof attached. My shop, my reputation, everything I've built here, it could all be destroyed by a story that isn't even entirely true." "Then we get ahead of it," Damien said, echoing Farah's earlier advice with renewed determination. "We tell the story ourselves, honestly, completely, before he has the chance to twist it into something ugly. I know it's frightening, Elena, but I truly believe the actual truth, messy and complicated as it is, will land far better with people than whatever calculated version he's planning to sell." Elena considered this for a long moment, weighing the terrifying vulnerability of exposing their entire complicated history against the alternative of allowing Victor Hale to control the narrative entirely on his own damaging terms. Finally, she nodded, steadying herself with the same stubborn resolve that had carried her through countless difficult moments over the past several months. "Okay," she said, "let's tell the truth. All of it. The dress, the mistake, the arrangement, all of it. If people are going to judge us, let them judge the actual story, not some twisted version designed to sell headlines." Damien studied her for a long moment, something like awe mixing with the worry still evident in his expression. "Are you certain? Once this is out, there's no taking it back. Everyone will know exactly how we began." "I'm certain," Elena said, and found, despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest, that she meant it completely. Better the whole truth than a lie someone else gets to tell about us. They spent the following hours drafting a statement together, Elena's shop transforming temporarily into a makeshift strategy room, papers and half-finished coffee cups scattered across her work table, as they worked to find exactly the right words to capture a story that had, despite its chaotic and unconventional beginning, become something entirely real and worth protecting. Farah joined them by video call as evening fell, offering careful editorial guidance, trimming excess detail, while preserving the honest heart of what Elena and Damien wanted to say. By the time they finished, exhausted but resolute, Elena felt a strange, steady calm settle over her, the fear of exposure gradually replaced by something closer to relief at finally releasing the full weight of a secret she had carried, in various forms, since that first chaotic night at the winter ball. Whatever Victor Hale intended to publish, whatever damage his calculated threats might still cause, Elena felt ready, for the first time, to face it honestly, standing beside a man who had proven, again and again, that he was willing to fight for the truth alongside her, rather than hide behind convenient lies. They published the statement the following morning, deliberately choosing to release it before Victor Hale's deadline, stripping whatever power his threatened exposure might have carried, by simply telling the story themselves first, completely and without shame. The response, once again, surprised Elena entirely. Rather than the harsh judgment she had braced herself for, most readers responded with warmth and even admiration, drawn in by the honest, unpolished nature of a story that felt far more relatable than the usual sanitized narratives surrounding wealthy families. Comments poured in, praising their courage, sharing their own stories of unexpected love found in the strangest circumstances, and Elena watched, with growing amazement, as the narrative she had feared would destroy her, instead seemed to strengthen the public's affection for their unlikely romance. Victor Hale's planned exposé, when it finally surfaced 2 days later on a minor gossip outlet, landed with far less impact than he clearly intended. The story, already old news compared to the honest, heartfelt account Elena and Damien had released first. Farah reported that his article received a fraction of the attention he had likely hoped for, most readers already familiar with, and largely sympathetic toward, the true story straight from the source. Elena allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, reading Farah's update that evening, curled up on her couch with a cup of tea, Damien beside her scrolling through his own phone with visible relief. "We actually did it," she said, still somewhat disbelieving. "We turned his whole scheme into nothing." "We did it together," Damien corrected, setting his phone aside to pull her closer against his side. "I don't think I could have faced any of this alone, honestly. Not the ball, not the article, not any of it." Elena rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear, and allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to fully relax into the quiet, hard-won peace of a relationship that had finally, completely, become their own, free of secrets, free of calculated deception, entirely and simply real. But even as she drifted into that rare, contented calm, she had no way of knowing that Victor Hale, humiliated by the failure of his rushed exposé, was already searching for a far more personal, far more damaging angle, one that would not target their public narrative at all, but rather the fragile, private history Elena had never shared publicly. The story of her father's disappearance from her family's life, so many years earlier, a wound she had never fully healed, and certainly never intended to expose to the world. Elena rarely spoke about her father, not even with grace, and certainly not in the careful, curated version of her life story she had shared publicly alongside Damien's family. He had left when she was 9 years old, disappearing one ordinary Tuesday morning, without explanation or warning, leaving behind nothing but a note so brief Elena had memorized every word of it decades ago, unable to forget its careless, hurried cruelty, no matter how hard she tried. She had built her entire adult life, in many ways, as a quiet rebellion against that abandonment, determined to become someone dependable, someone who followed through on every promise, someone whose word actually meant something to the people who trusted her. Her flower shop, with its careful attention to every small detail, its reliability, through even the most demanding wedding seasons, had become, in some private way she rarely examined too closely, a monument to everything her father had failed to be. She had told Damien a softened version of this history weeks earlier, mentioning only that her father had left when she was young, without elaborating on the specific details that still ached, even now, whenever she allowed herself to think too deeply about them. She had never imagined that history might resurface as a weapon in someone else's calculated scheme. The message arrived on a Wednesday evening, this time not to Elena directly, but as a public comment beneath the joint statement she and Damien had released days earlier, posted under an anonymous account that Elena immediately suspected, with a sick, sinking certainty, belonged to Victor Hale. Interesting how Elena Marchetti built her whole reputation on reliability, when her own father walked out on their family without a word. Some patterns run in families, don't they? Elena stared at the comment for a long time, before finally showing it to Damien, her hands trembling with an anger and hurt that felt entirely different from the fear she had experienced during the earlier financial threats. This wasn't about money, or business dealings, or public relations strategy. This was about the most private, painful chapter of her personal history, dragged into public view for nothing more than the calculated purpose of causing pain. "How does he even know about this?" Elena asked, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I've never spoken about my father publicly, not once. Not to anyone outside my closest friends and family. Damien read the comment with a darkening expression, his jaw tight with obvious anger on her behalf. I don't know, he admitted, but we're going to find out. This has gone beyond acceptable, Elena. Whatever grievance he has with my family, dragging your father into it is entirely unjustified. It's not just unjustified, Elena said, tears finally beginning to fall despite her best efforts to hold them back. It's cruel. He's trying to make people believe I'm somehow like my father, like abandonment and unreliability are just written into my blood, when I've spent my entire adult life trying to be exactly the opposite of that man. Damien pulled her into his arms without hesitation, holding her steady while she finally allowed herself to cry, the accumulated stress of the past several weeks finally breaking through the careful composure she had maintained throughout every previous challenge. He said nothing for a long while, simply held her, his hand moving in slow, steady circles against her back until her breathing gradually calmed. I'm going to handle this, he said finally, his voice carrying a quiet, controlled fury that Elena had never heard from him before. Not with another public statement, not this time. This is personal, and it deserves a personal response. What are you going to do? Elena asked, pulling back slightly to search his face. I'm going to find him, Damien said simply, and I'm going to make sure he understands exactly what happens when someone tries to hurt the people I love, for nothing more than personal profit. Elena felt a flicker of alarm at the intensity in his voice, worried about what desperate anger might drive him toward. But before she could voice her concern, her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from an unknown number that, after a moment's hesitation, she finally answered. Elena Marchetti, said a smooth, unfamiliar voice on the other end. I believe we should talk. My name is Victor Hale, and I think you'll find I'm considerably more reasonable than you might expect, given the circumstances. Elena's blood ran cold, but she forced herself to remain steady, gesturing urgently for Damien to listen in as she put the call on speaker. What do you want? She asked, her voice carrying a firmness she didn't entirely feel. I want you to understand that this was never actually personal, Victor said, his tone carrying an unsettling calm that felt more disturbing than outright hostility might have. I lost my position at Castellano Industries 6 months ago, after uncovering some rather troubling irregularities in the company's overseas dealings. Irregularities that Damien's father was, shall we say, less than eager to have exposed. I was quietly dismissed, my reputation quietly damaged, and my attempts to raise the issue through proper channels were quietly ignored. I simply found a way to make sure someone finally paid attention to what I had to say. Damien's expression darkened further, though he remained silent, listening intently as Victor continued. The article about your relationship, the financial threats, even the mention of your father, none of it was ever really about the two of you specifically, Victor said. It was about forcing the Castellano family to finally acknowledge what they've spent months trying to bury. You simply happen to be convenient leverage, given how much attention your relationship has already attracted. That doesn't make what you did to Elena acceptable, Damien said sharply, unable to remain silent any longer. Whatever grievance you have with my father's business dealings, it has nothing to do with her. You crossed a line, dragging her family history into this. Perhaps, Victor admitted, and something in his tone suggested a flicker of genuine reconsideration. I'll admit, that particular detail felt uncomfortable even as I published it. Desperation makes people careless about lines they might otherwise respect. What do you actually want? Elena asked again, steadying her voice, despite the tumult of emotions still churning inside her. If this was never truly about us, then tell us what would actually satisfy you enough to stop. There was a long pause on the line before Victor finally answered, his voice carrying a weariness that suggested months of frustrated, ignored grievance finally reaching its breaking point. I want the irregularities I discovered properly investigated, he said. Not buried, not quietly settled behind closed doors, the way everything in that family seems to be handled. A real, independent investigation, with real consequences if wrongdoing is confirmed. If that happens, I have no further interest in either of you, and I will retract every damaging claim I've made, including the one about your father. Elena looked at Damien, watching the war of emotions playing across his face as he weighed the weight of Victor's demand against his own family's reputation and business interests. Whatever answer he gave next, Elena understood, would reveal exactly how far he was willing to go to protect not just her, but the deeper values he had begun questioning himself weeks earlier. sitting in her quiet shop and wondering aloud what he might have chosen for his own life, if anyone had ever actually given him the choice. "I'll look into it personally," Damien said finally, his voice steady with a resolve that Elena recognized as genuine rather than merely strategic. "Not because you've threatened us, Victor, but because if what you're describing is true, it deserves to be investigated, regardless of how this conversation ends. I won't make promises about specific outcomes until I've seen the actual evidence myself, but I give you my word that I will not simply bury this the way you claim my father did." "And Elena's father?" Victor asked. "The comment about her family history? Take it down," Damien said firmly. "Immediately, and issue a correction acknowledging it was an unfair and irrelevant attack. Whatever grievance you have with my family, Elena had absolutely nothing to do with it, and she deserves an apology, not further exposure of a painful chapter in her life that was never any of your business." There was another pause, and when Victor spoke again, his voice carried something closer to genuine contrition than Elena had expected from the calculated, controlled tone of earlier in the call. "You're right," he said. "That was beneath even my desperation. I'll remove it within the hour and post a correction." "Thank you," Elena said quietly, some of the tension finally beginning to ease from her shoulders. "For what it's worth," Victor added, his voice softer now. "The story of your relationship, the parts that were actually true, it was a good story. Better than the sensational version I initially tried to sell. I hope, for both your sakes, that it continues exactly as honestly as it started." The call ended shortly after, leaving Elena and Damien standing together in her small apartment, the weight of the past hour's confrontation gradually settling into something more manageable, more hopeful, than either of them had expected when the phone first rang. "Do you actually believe him?" Elena asked. "About the irregularities in your father's business?" "I don't know yet," Damien admitted, running a tired hand through his hair. "But I intend to find out, properly and thoroughly, regardless of what it might mean for my family's reputation. If my father has been covering up genuine wrongdoing, that's not something I'm willing to simply ignore, no matter how uncomfortable the investigation might become." Elena studied him for a long moment, admiration warming through the exhaustion still lingering from the day's emotional toll. "That can't be an easy decision," she said, "investigating your own father." "It isn't," Damien agreed, "but you asked me once what I might have chosen for myself, if anyone had actually given me the choice. I think this is part of the answer. I want to build something honest, Elena, in my business and in my life. I can't do that while quietly protecting wrongdoing, simply because it's inconvenient to expose." Elena reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his with a quiet, steady certainty that had grown, over these past weeks, into something far more solid than the careful, cautious arrangement they had first negotiated. "Whatever you decide to do," she said, "I'll be beside you through it." "I'm counting on that," Damien said, a small, tired smile finally breaking through his earlier tension. Victor's correction went up within the hour, exactly as he had promised, the offensive comment about Elena's father removed and replaced with a brief, genuine apology, acknowledging the attack had been unfair and irrelevant to the actual story he intended to tell. Elena read it with a strange mixture of relief and lingering vulnerability, grateful the wound had been closed but still aware, somewhere deep beneath the relief, that the exposure had reopened an old hurt she would need time to fully process, regardless of how quickly the public comment itself had been resolved. Later that night, once Damien had reluctantly returned home to begin the difficult work of investigating his father's business dealings, Elena sat alone on her couch, staring at the framed photograph on her side table, one of the few pictures she owned of her mother in younger, happier years, taken long before Elena's father's departure had changed the shape of their small family forever. She picked up her phone and called Grace, needing to hear a familiar, steady voice after the emotional whirlwind of the day. "He brought up Dad," Elena said quietly, once her sister answered, publicly, as some kind of twisted comparison, trying to suggest I might be like him. Grace was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the particular gentleness she reserved for their rarest, most vulnerable conversations about their father. "That must have hurt," she said simply. "I'm sorry, Elena." "It did," Elena admitted. "More than I expected. I thought I'd made my peace with all of that a long time ago, but apparently there's still a raw nerve sitting right beneath the surface, waiting for someone to press on it. That doesn't make you weak, Grace said firmly. It makes you human. Dad left a wound that never fully closes, not completely, no matter how much time passes or how successful you become despite him. But Elena, listen to me. You are nothing like him. You have spent your entire adult life proving exactly the opposite, one reliable, honest choice at a time. Don't let one cruel comment convince you otherwise, even for a moment. Elena felt tears gathering again, though these carried more warmth than pain. Gratitude for a sister who had weathered the same difficult childhood beside her and emerged, in her own way, equally determined to build a life built on trust and reliability, rather than the careless abandonment they had both endured. Thank you, Elena said softly. I needed to hear that tonight. Anytime, Grace said. That's what sisters are for, especially the ones who accidentally get engaged at fancy parties because of borrowed dresses. Elena laughed despite herself, the sound breaking through some of the lingering heaviness of the day. I walked right into that one, didn't I? You did, Grace agreed, laughing along with her. But for what it's worth, Elena, whatever complicated, ridiculous path led you here, I think it's leading you somewhere genuinely good. Damien seems to actually see you, the real you, not just the story everyone else keeps trying to write about you. Elena thought about this long after the call ended, curled up beneath a blanket in her quiet apartment, the events of the past several weeks finally settling into something she could examine with a clearer, steadier perspective. Whatever had begun as an accident, whatever complications and threats had emerged in its wake, she recognized now, with a certainty that felt entirely her own, that the connection between herself and Damien had grown into something worth protecting, worth fighting for, regardless of how many more obstacles still waited ahead of them. She fell asleep that night, with a quiet, hopeful resolve settling over her, unaware that Damien, in a quiet office across the city, had already begun uncovering evidence far more troubling than either of them had anticipated. Evidence that would soon force him to make a decision that could threaten not just his family's business, but the very foundation of trust he had worked so hard to build with the woman he had grown to love. Damien sat at his father's desk long after the rest of the office had emptied for the night, a stack of shipping records and financial ledgers spread across the polished mahogany surface, each document raising more questions than it answered. What had begun as a simple attempt to verify or dismiss Victor's accusations had, over the course of several hours, transformed into a growing certainty that something within the company's overseas dealings had indeed been handled with far less integrity than his family's public reputation suggested. He rubbed his tired eyes and reached for his phone, staring at a photograph of Elena for a long moment before setting it aside, steadying himself for the difficult conversation he knew waited ahead, not just with Victor, but with his own father, whose careful, guarded silence over the years suddenly made a great deal more troubling sense than Damien had ever allowed himself to consider. Whatever answers he found in these documents, he understood, with a heavy, resolute certainty, that there would be no quiet, comfortable way to unearth them, without changing something fundamental about his family, his business, and the future he had only just begun allowing himself to imagine alongside Elena. Damien requested a meeting with his father the following morning, choosing the quiet privacy of the family study rather than the formal boardroom where such conversations usually took place. Marco Castellano sat behind his own desk, a smaller, older version of the one Damien had occupied the night before, his expression carefully neutral as his son laid out the documents he had gathered, each one a small piece of evidence pointing toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. These shipping manifests don't match the customs declarations from the same period, Damien said, spreading the papers across the desk between them. And this account here, routed through a subsidiary in a jurisdiction with minimal oversight, shows transfers that don't correspond to any legitimate business activity I can identify. Father, I need you to tell me honestly, did you know about this? Marco was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents with an expression that gradually shifted from careful neutrality to something closer to resignation. When he finally looked up at his son, the weariness in his eyes told Damien everything he needed to know before his father even spoke a single word. I knew, Marco admitted quietly. Not all of it, not at first, but enough that I should have acted sooner than I did. Damien felt something heavy settle in his chest, disappointment mixing uncomfortably with a strange, aching sympathy for the father he had always viewed as unshakably composed, someone who navigated every business challenge with practiced, effortless confidence. Seeing him now, shoulders slightly stooped beneath the weight of a secret he had carried alone for months, Damien understood for the first time how heavily the burden of running this family's legacy had actually pressed down on the man across from him. "Why didn't you address it properly?" Damien asked. "Why let it continue, rather than reporting it and dealing with whatever consequences followed?" "Because I was afraid," Marco admitted, the words clearly costing him considerable effort to voice aloud. "Afraid of what a public scandal might do to everything my own father built, everything I've spent my entire life protecting and expanding. Afraid of what it might mean for your future, for the company you'll eventually inherit. I told myself I was quietly working to correct the issue internally, phasing out the problematic contracts, without drawing attention to how they began in the first place. I convinced myself that was a responsible solution, rather than simple cowardice dressed up in careful language." Damien sat back in his chair, absorbing his father's admission, with a complicated mixture of understanding and lingering disappointment. He thought of Victor Hale, dismissed and silenced, for attempting to raise exactly this concern through proper channels, his reputation quietly damaged for the crime of insisting on honesty his employer wasn't prepared to face. "There was an analyst," Damien said slowly. "Victor Hale. He discovered this same irregularity months ago and was dismissed shortly after raising it. Did you know about that too?" Marco's expression tightened with fresh discomfort. "I was told he was let go due to performance concerns," he said. "I didn't ask further questions. I should have. I understand that now, seeing how this has unfolded. He's the one who's been threatening Elena and me for weeks," Damien said, watching his father's face carefully for his reaction. "Publishing articles, making financial accusations, even attacking Elena's personal history, all because he felt his legitimate concerns were dismissed and buried rather than properly addressed." Marco's face paled slightly, genuine shock replacing his earlier resignation. "I had no idea his dismissal led to this," he said. "Damien, I am truly sorry, for Elena, for you, for the position my own poor judgment has put you both in." "I don't need your apology," Damien said, though his tone had softened somewhat, understanding settling in alongside his earlier frustration. "I need you to help me fix this properly. Not quietly, not through careful internal correction that avoids public accountability. A genuine, transparent investigation, with real consequences for whatever wrongdoing occurred, and genuine reinstatement or compensation for Victor Hale, given how unfairly he was treated for simply telling the truth." Marco studied his son for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes, a flicker of pride emerging through the discomfort of the conversation. "You've changed," he said quietly, "these past months, since that ridiculous ball and this whole unexpected relationship began. You've grown into someone considerably more willing to challenge difficult truths than I remember you being before." "Elena taught me that," Damien said simply. "That protecting people you love sometimes means facing hard truths honestly, rather than quietly shielding them from difficulty. I spent years believing the family's careful, controlled image was worth protecting above almost everything else. I don't believe that anymore." Marco nodded slowly, something like acceptance settling over his expression. "Then let's do this properly," he said. "Together, if you're willing. I owe this company, and this family's actual integrity, considerably more than I've given it these past several months." They spent the remainder of the morning drafting a plan for the investigation, Marco reaching out personally to the board to request an independent review, Damien preparing a statement acknowledging the company's willingness to address any wrongdoing transparently, rather than defensively. It was slow, difficult work, considerably more complicated than any public relations statement Farah had helped them craft in response to the earlier articles. But Elena, arriving at the estate that afternoon to check on Damien's progress, found something genuinely hopeful in watching father and son work through the difficult process together, side by side, rather than in the isolated, guarded silence that had apparently defined their relationship for years before. "How are you feeling about all of this?" Elena asked quietly, finding Damien alone in the garden during a brief break from the difficult work inside, snow finally beginning to melt around the edges of the paths as an early hint of spring crept into the winter afternoon. "Exhausted," Damien admitted, pulling her close against his side. "But also, strangely, more at peace than I've felt in years. There's something freeing about finally facing a problem honestly, rather than quietly managing it from a careful, comfortable distance. "I'm proud of you," Elena said softly. "This can't have been an easy conversation to have with your father." "It wasn't," Damien agreed. "But you were right, weeks ago, when you told me it wasn't too late to figure out what I might actually want, rather than simply inheriting decisions made before I was born. I think this is part of that. Choosing honesty, even when it's difficult, even when it risks the careful image my family has spent generations protecting." Elena rested her head against his shoulder, watching the melting snow drip slowly from the bare garden branches above them, and felt a quiet, steady gratitude settle over her, grateful not just for the man beside her, but for the entire strange, unexpected journey that had brought them both to this moment of hard-won honesty. Victor Hale, once informed of the company's genuine commitment to a transparent investigation, agreed to a formal meeting with Marco and the board's independent reviewer, his earlier hostility gradually softening into cautious, guarded hope that his months of frustrated grievance might finally receive the honest acknowledgement he had originally sought. The investigation, once properly underway, uncovered exactly the irregularities Damien had suspected, though considerably less severe than the worst possible scenario he had privately feared, allowing the company to address the wrongdoing through legitimate legal channels without triggering the kind of catastrophic scandal that might have destroyed decades of otherwise legitimate business relationships. By the time the investigation concluded several weeks later, Victor had been offered both a formal apology and a substantial settlement for his earlier unjust dismissal, along with a consulting position advising the company on stronger internal oversight going forward, an outcome that satisfied his original grievance far more completely than any sensational article ever could have managed. Elena watched this entire process unfold with quiet admiration for Damien's steady determination throughout, recognizing in him exactly the kind of integrity she had always hoped to find in a partner, even if she had never expected to find it wrapped in quite so unconventional a beginning. With the investigation resolved and the earlier threats finally quieted, Elena felt, for the first time since that chaotic winter night, that she and Damien might actually be granted a stretch of genuine peace, free from calculated schemes or lingering secrets threatening to unravel everything they had carefully built together. She threw herself back into her shop with renewed energy, grateful for the familiar comfort of ordinary work after months of unexpected chaos, arranging bouquets and managing orders with a lightness she hadn't felt in longer than she cared to admit. Sophia, delighted by the peaceful turn of events, began dropping unsubtle hints about wanting to host another family gathering, this time simply to celebrate rather than to navigate any particular crisis, and Elena found herself looking forward to the invitation, rather than dreading it, a stark contrast to the anxious uncertainty that had accompanied her very first visit to the Castellano estate all those months ago. It was during one of these quiet, ordinary afternoons at her shop, several weeks after the investigation's conclusion, that Damien arrived earlier than usual, his expression carrying a nervous energy Elena hadn't seen from him since the earliest days of their relationship. "You're here early," Elena observed, setting down her shears as he approached, something in his demeanor immediately catching her attention. "Everything all right?" "Everything's more than all right," Damien said, though his hands, she noticed, were slightly unsteady as he reached for hers. "I actually wanted to ask you something, and I've been trying to figure out the right moment for weeks now, but I think I've finally stopped waiting for perfect, and decided that today, right here in your shop, surrounded by flowers you chose and arranged with your own hands, is exactly the right place after all." Elena's heart began to race, understanding dawning slowly as Damien reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers closing around something small enough to fit easily in his palm. "Elena," he began, his voice carrying a vulnerability she had rarely heard from him, even during their most honest, unguarded moments together. "I know our story started in the strangest possible way. A borrowed dress, a misunderstood tradition, a mistake neither of us planned or expected. But somewhere along the way, that mistake became the truest, most important thing that has ever happened to me." He lowered himself to one knee, right there among the buckets of fresh stems and the familiar scent of green leaves and cold water that Elena had spent 5 years building into a life entirely her own, and opened his palm to reveal a small velvet box. "I don't need an old family tradition to tell me what I already know in my own heart," he continued, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring that caught the afternoon light streaming through her shop windows. "I'm asking you honestly, deliberately, with absolutely no misunderstanding involved this time. Elena Marchetti, will you marry me? Elena stared down at him, tears already spilling freely down her cheeks, her hands pressed against her mouth as the weight of the moment settled over her, months of chaos and uncertainty, and hard-won honesty, culminating in this simple, sincere question, asked in the most ordinary, meaningful place she could imagine. Yes, she said, the word emerging as barely more than a whisper, before she found her voice again, laughing and crying simultaneously, as Damien rose to his feet and pulled her into his arms. Yes, absolutely yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, with hands that trembled slightly, despite his earlier composure, and Elena held her hand up to the light, marveling at the simple, elegant band that represented, finally, a promise made entirely on their own terms, free of misunderstood traditions or family expectations, chosen deliberately and completely by two people who had found their way to each other through the strangest, most unlikely circumstances imaginable. I can't believe you actually did this here, Elena said, laughing through her remaining tears as she gestured around the familiar, unglamorous space of her shop, buckets of stems and half-finished arrangements scattered across every surface. In the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, surrounded by wilting carnations and my terrible taste in radio stations. Where else would I ask you? Damien said, grinning at her, with an unguarded happiness that made her heart swell further. This shop is entirely yours, built with your own hands, your own hard work, your own vision. It felt exactly right to ask you here, in the place that shows the world who you actually are, rather than some borrowed ballroom that started this whole complicated mess in the first place. Elena laughed again, pulling him down for a kiss that tasted like relief and joy, and every complicated, wonderful step that had led them both to this precise, unglamorous, perfect moment. Oliver, arriving for his afternoon shift moments later, stopped dead in the doorway at the sight of them, his eyes going wide as he registered the ring now sparkling on Elena's hand. Did I just walk in on a proposal? He asked, equal parts delighted and mortified at his own timing. You did, Elena said, still laughing, wiping at her damp cheeks with the back of her hand. Congratulations. You have excellent timing for witnessing history. I'm telling everyone I know, Oliver announced immediately, already reaching for his phone, and Elena found she didn't mind at all, grateful this time for news that carried nothing but genuine, uncomplicated joy, entirely free of the calculated schemes and public scrutiny that had shadowed so much of their earlier journey together. They called Sophia together that evening, both of them crowded around Elena's phone in her small apartment, and listened to the older woman's delighted, tearful reaction, with matching smiles stretched wide across their faces. I knew it, Sophia said, her voice thick with emotion, even through the phone's tinny speaker. I knew from the very first moment you walked through those doors in that ivory dress, dear girl, whatever the circumstances, that something meaningful had finally arrived in my grandson's life. I simply didn't expect it would take quite so many dramatic turns to reach this particular ending. Neither did we, Nana, Damien admitted, laughing softly as he pulled Elena closer against his side. But I think, looking back, I wouldn't change a single complicated step of it, even the parts that nearly went terribly wrong along the way. Elena rested her head against his shoulder, listening to Sophia's continued delighted planning, already beginning on the other end of the line, and felt, with a certainty that settled warm and steady through her entire body, that whatever challenges still waited ahead as they planned an actual wedding together, they would face them exactly as they had faced everything else these past several months, honestly, steadily, and completely together. Grace arrived at Elena's apartment within the hour, having received Oliver's excited message before Elena had even finished calling her personally, and the two sisters embraced tightly, Grace's own eyes bright with happy tears, as she admired the ring sparkling on Elena's finger. I told you, Grace said, laughing softly. I told you this was leading somewhere good, even with all the chaos along the way. You did, Elena admitted, smiling at the memory of that early, uncertain conversation on her worn couch, weeks that felt like an entirely different lifetime ago now. I should probably start listening to you more often. Probably, Grace agreed, grinning, though I'll admit, even I didn't imagine it would end quite this dramatically. Financial investigations, gossip articles, threatening messages. You two didn't take the easy road toward happiness, that's for certain. No, Elena agreed, glancing down at her ring with a soft, contented smile. But I think, in the end, it made everything feel considerably more real than if we'd simply had an easy, uncomplicated beginning. We know now, without question, exactly what we're both willing to fight for. Grace squeezed her sister's hand warmly, and the two of them sat together late into the evening, planning the early, joyful details of a wedding that Elena, only months earlier, could never have imagined finding herself preparing for. All because of one borrowed ivory dress and a single, life-altering mistake that had somehow become the truest beginning of her entire life. Wedding planning began in earnest within days, though Elena quickly discovered that combining her own modest expectations with the Castellano family's considerable resources required careful, occasionally difficult negotiation. Sophia, delighted beyond measure by the engagement, immediately began suggesting venues grand enough to rival the winter ball itself, while Elena found herself gently but firmly advocating for something smaller, more personal, reflecting the genuine relationship they had built, rather than the public spectacle their romance had briefly become. "I don't want cameras everywhere," Elena explained one afternoon, sitting across from Sophia in the estate's smaller sitting room, wedding magazines spread across the table between them. "I want our closest family and friends, good food, flowers I've arranged myself, and enough quiet space to actually enjoy the day, rather than performing it for an audience." Sophia studied her for a long moment, something warm and understanding softening her sharp features. "You know," she said finally, "when I married Damien's grandfather, we had a small gathering, exactly like what you're describing. It was only later, as the business grew and our family's public profile expanded, that these grand, elaborate celebrations became expected rather than chosen. Perhaps it's time we remembered what actually matters most in a wedding, rather than simply what tradition or expectation demands." Elena felt a wave of relief and gratitude at Sophia's understanding, and the two women spent the following hours planning a celebration that honored both Elena's preference for genuine simplicity and Sophia's desire to properly celebrate a union she had grown to treasure as much as her own grandson's happiness. They settled on a modest garden ceremony at the estate, close family and true friends only, followed by a dinner reception in the same sitting room where Sophia had first learned the truth behind Elena and Damien's complicated beginning. Damien, when consulted, offered few opinions beyond a clear preference that Elena's own vision guide most decisions, though he insisted firmly on one particular detail that made Elena laugh with delighted surprise when he first proposed it. "I want you to design the flowers yourself," he said. "Every arrangement, every bouquet, exactly as you would for any other client, except this time for your own wedding. I want the day to reflect who you actually are, not some borrowed version of elegance neither of us truly needs." "That's going to be an enormous amount of work," Elena warned, though she couldn't suppress the pleased smile spreading across her face at the suggestion. "I have complete confidence in your abilities," Damien said, kissing her forehead affectionately. "Besides, Oliver has already offered to help however needed, and I suspect half your regular clients would volunteer their assistance too, if you simply asked." Elena found this prediction proved entirely accurate over the following weeks. Her small community of regular clients and fellow local business owners rallying enthusiastically around her upcoming wedding, offering assistance with everything from catering suggestions to seating arrangements, transforming what could have been an overwhelming solo undertaking into a genuinely collaborative celebration built by people who had watched her build her shop and her reputation, one honest, careful arrangement at a time. Priya, now firmly established as a genuine friend rather than a wary rival, proved particularly invaluable during the planning process. Her insider knowledge of the Castellano family's various preferences and traditions, helping Elena navigate the more complicated aspects of blending her own modest vision with the family's considerable expectations. "You know," Priya said one afternoon, helping Elena sort through fabric swatches for the reception tablecloths, "I never imagined we would end up here, planning your wedding together like old friends. Life has a strange way of surprising us sometimes." "It certainly does," Elena agreed, smiling as she held up a soft ivory swatch, before quickly setting it aside with a rueful laugh. "Though I think I'll be avoiding this particular color for my own dress, given everything it's already put us through." Priya laughed warmly at this, The easy camaraderie between them now feeling entirely natural after months of gradually building trust and genuine friendship. Probably wise, she agreed. Though I imagine whatever color you do choose, Damien will still look at you exactly the same way he did that very first night, regardless of what tradition it might or might not accidentally represent. As the wedding date approached, drawing closer with each passing week of careful, joyful preparation, Elena found herself reflecting often on the strange, winding path that had led her here. From a chaotic, mistaken entrance at a stranger's ball, to this quiet, deliberate celebration of a love she had never expected to find, built carefully and honestly through every difficult challenge they had faced together along the way. She thought, too, of her father, an old wound that had never fully healed despite years of quiet acceptance, and found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, feeling something closer to genuine peace about his absence rather than lingering hurt. Whatever he had failed to give her, whatever unreliable example he had set during her childhood, she had built, deliberately and carefully, an entirely different life, one defined by trust and honesty, and the steady, dependable love she had found in Damien, rather than the fractured example her father had left behind. Grace, sensing this quiet reflection during one of their regular planning sessions together, reached across the table to squeeze her sister's hand gently. "You know," she said, "I think Mom would be incredibly proud of you, if she could see how far you've come from those early years, cleaning offices at night, just to afford your first flower arranging classes." Elena felt tears gather unexpectedly at the mention of their mother, gone now nearly 8 years, though the grief had long since settled into something gentler, more grateful than painful. "I think she would be," Elena agreed softly. "I only wish she could have met Damien, met his family, seen how everything eventually turned out despite such a chaotic, complicated beginning." "She's here in spirit," Grace said firmly. "In every arrangement you design, every careful choice you make for this wedding. I truly believe that, Elena." Elena nodded, wiping gently at her damp eyes before returning her attention to the wedding preparations spread across the table between them, grateful beyond measure for a sister who understood, better than almost anyone, exactly how far this particular journey had carried her, from where she had once believed her ordinary, hard-working life might lead. 2 weeks before the wedding, Elena received an unexpected visit at her shop, one that momentarily threatened to unsettle the peaceful rhythm of her final preparations, though ultimately in a way that offered unexpected, welcome closure to a chapter of her past she had long assumed remained permanently unresolved. The bell above her door chimed on a quiet Thursday afternoon, and Elena looked up from her work table to find an older man standing hesitantly near the entrance, his weathered face carrying a nervous uncertainty that seemed strangely, unsettlingly familiar, even though she couldn't immediately place why. It took her several long seconds, studying the gray at his temples and the particular way he held his shoulders, slightly stooped as though bracing for rejection, before recognition finally settled over her with a jolt that nearly knocked the shears from her hand. "Dad," she said, the word emerging as barely more than a whisper, decades of unresolved emotion suddenly crowding into the small, familiar space of her shop. "Elena," her father said quietly, his voice rougher than she remembered, carrying the particular texture of years spent, she would later learn, working difficult jobs in difficult places, trying and repeatedly failing to build the kind of steady life he had abandoned so carelessly all those years ago. "The one about your engagement, I hope it's all right that I came." Elena stood frozen behind her work table for a long moment, a dozen conflicting emotions warring within her chest, anger and curiosity, and a strange, cautious hope, all tangled together in ways she hadn't anticipated needing to untangle so unexpectedly on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. "Why now?" she finally managed to ask. "After all these years, why come now?" Her father's expression carried genuine shame, his hands twisting nervously in front of him as he searched for words that clearly didn't come easily. "I've thought about reaching out more times than I can count," he admitted. "Every year, I told myself the timing wasn't right, that too much time had passed, that you and Grace were better off without the complication of my reappearance. Seeing your engagement announcement, seeing how happy you looked, how much you've built for yourself despite everything, I suppose it finally gave me the courage I'd been lacking for years." Elena studied him carefully, weighing his words against the deep, familiar hurt she had carried since childhood. the careless note he had left behind, still memorized word for word, despite every year that had passed since. "I'm not sure what you're hoping for," she said finally. "Honestly. An apology doesn't erase 20 years of absence, Dad. I built my entire life around learning to depend on myself, precisely because I couldn't depend on you." "I know," her father said, tears now visible in his tired eyes. "I'm not here expecting forgiveness, Elena, or even a relationship, if that feels like too much to offer. I'm here simply because I wanted you to know, before your wedding, that I am proud of the woman you've become, entirely on your own, despite every disadvantage I gave you by leaving. I wanted you to know that, whatever happens next, whether you want me at your wedding or never want to see me again, I finally found the courage to say that out loud, in person, rather than continuing to hide behind decades of cowardly silence." Elena felt tears gathering in her own eyes now, complicated and layered, grief for the childhood she had lost mixing uncomfortably with a cautious, uncertain gratitude for this unexpected, imperfect gesture of accountability, arriving so many years later than it should have. She thought of Victor Hale's cruel public comment weeks earlier, the old wound it had reopened, and found, standing here now facing the actual source of that pain directly, that something in her finally felt ready to begin working toward closure, even if forgiveness itself remained a longer, more complicated journey still ahead. "I need time," Elena said finally. "Honestly. I can't simply pretend the last 20 years didn't happen, Dad. But I also don't think I want to close this door entirely. Not without at least trying to understand what happened, and what you've been through since." Her father nodded, visible relief, and continued sorrow mixing in his expression. "That's more than I hoped for," he said quietly. "Take whatever time you need, Elena. I'm not going anywhere this time. I promise you that." They talked for nearly an hour after that, careful and cautious, Elena keeping her guard up, even as small pieces of understanding gradually emerged between them. Her father's own difficult history, slowly filling in gaps she had spent decades imagining, without ever truly knowing. It wasn't reconciliation, not fully, not yet, but it was a beginning, honest and imperfect, exactly the kind of difficult, worthwhile conversation she had learned, over these past several months with Damien, was always better pursued directly than avoided out of fear. She told Damien about the visit that evening, curled beside him on her couch, and he listened with quiet, steady attention, offering support without pushing her toward any particular decision about her father's place, if any, in her upcoming wedding, or her future life beyond it. "Whatever you decide," Damien said gently, "I'll support you completely. This is your history to navigate, Elena, on whatever timeline feels right to you." "I think," Elena said slowly, working through the thought even as she spoke it aloud, "I think I might invite him. Not as a grand gesture of forgiveness, but simply as an acknowledgement that closed doors don't always have to stay closed forever. Especially not on a day meant to celebrate exactly the kind of honest, deliberate love I never witnessed growing up." Damien pulled her closer, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "I think that sounds like exactly the kind of brave, honest choice you've made throughout this entire journey," he said. "I'm proud of you, Elena, for finding room in your heart for that kind of grace, even after everything." Elena rested against him, feeling the quiet, steady comfort of his presence settle over her, and allowed herself, for the first time in years, to imagine a version of her wedding day that included not just the joyful future she was building with Damien, but a small, careful step toward healing the difficult past that had shaped so much of who she had become along the way. In the days that followed, Elena found herself calling her father more often than she initially expected. Careful, brief conversations that gradually grew slightly longer and slightly warmer with each exchange, though the old caution never fully disappeared from her voice. She told Grace about the visit as well, watching her sister absorb the news with a complicated mixture of surprise and guarded hope that mirrored Elena's own uncertain feelings. "I don't know if I'm ready to see him yet," Grace admitted during one of their evening calls. "But I'm glad you're finding whatever peace works for you, Elena. You've always been more forgiving than me, even when we were kids." "It's not really forgiveness," Elena tried to explain. "Not entirely, anyway. It's more like deciding I don't want to carry the weight of that anger into this new chapter of my life. I want to walk into my marriage as light as I can manage, Grace, and holding on to old resentment doesn't seem to serve that goal anymore." Grace was quiet for a moment, considering this. That's a healthier way to think about it than I probably would have managed, she said finally. Maybe I'll get there myself, eventually, just not yet. There's no timeline you need to follow, Elena reassured her. This is entirely your own journey to walk, whenever and however feels right to you. As the wedding date drew nearer, Elena extended a careful, tentative invitation to her father, explaining honestly that she wasn't offering full reconciliation, simply an opportunity for him to witness this important chapter of her life, if he chose to attend quietly, without expectation of a larger role in the celebration itself. He accepted with visible gratitude, promising to respect whatever boundaries she needed to set. And Elena felt, finalizing this small, complicated decision, a genuine sense of forward movement. A door not fully reopened, but no longer locked entirely shut either. Sophia, upon hearing the full story from Damien, insisted on meeting Elena's father personally before the wedding, her sharp instincts for reading people extending, it seemed, even to complicated family reconciliations, far beyond her own immediate circle. Every family carries difficult history, Sophia told Elena during one of their regular planning sessions, patting her hand with characteristic warmth. What matters most is not whether that history was perfect, but whether we choose, deliberately, to build something better moving forward. It sounds to me as though you are doing exactly that, dear girl, with considerable courage. Elena thanked her, grateful once again for the older woman's steady, wise perspective throughout every complicated turn this unlikely journey had carried them through together. With her father's cautious re-entry into her life settled into a manageable, honest arrangement, and her wedding plans now nearing their final, joyful preparations, Elena felt a quiet, hard-won peace settling over her entire life. Every difficult chapter of the past several months finally converging toward the celebration she had never imagined finding, back on that chaotic winter night when she first, accidentally, wore the wrong dress to the wrong ball. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and bright, an early spring sun melting the last stubborn patches of snow across the Castellano estate's gardens, where rows of white chairs had been arranged beneath a simple wooden arch Elena herself had decorated with cascading greenery and soft, ivory roses, chosen deliberately this time, with full knowledge and joyful intention, rather than accidental misunderstanding. Elena stood in the same small sitting room where Sophia had first welcomed her so many months earlier, watching her reflection in a tall mirror as Grace carefully adjusted the delicate lace along her shoulders. The dress was nothing like the borrowed gown from that chaotic winter night, though Elena had chosen ivory again, deliberately, a quiet, private joke shared only between herself and Damien, a way of reclaiming the accidental beginning that had led them both here. "You look beautiful," Grace said softly, meeting Elena's eyes in the mirror's reflection, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mom would be so proud, seeing you today." "I keep thinking that too," Elena admitted, smoothing her hands nervously over the soft fabric of her dress. "I wish she could actually be here." "She is," Grace said firmly, echoing the words she had offered weeks earlier, during their wedding planning. "In every flower you chose, every careful detail you designed yourself. She's here, Elena, exactly as much as anyone could be." A soft knock sounded at the door, and Sophia entered a moment later, dressed elegantly in deep blue, her sharp eyes immediately filling with tears at the sight of Elena in her wedding dress. "Oh, my darling girl," she said, crossing the room to take Elena's hands in her own familiar, steady grip. "You look absolutely radiant." "Thank you, Sophia," Elena said, embracing the older woman carefully, to avoid disturbing either of their carefully arranged outfits. "Thank you for everything, honestly, for welcoming me that very first night, even when everything was such a confusing mess, for trusting me, eventually, with the whole complicated truth." "It was never truly a mistake, you know," Sophia said, pulling back to study Elena's face with characteristic warmth. "Whatever confusion brought you through those doors that night, I believe some things are simply meant to find their way to us, however unconventional the path. You were always meant to become part of this family, dear girl, ivory dress or not." Elena felt fresh tears threatening, and Grace laughed softly, reaching for a tissue to carefully dab beneath Elena's eyes before her careful makeup could be disturbed. "No crying yet," Grace warned gently. "Save it for the actual ceremony, when Damien sees you walking down that aisle." A final knock sounded, and Elena's father appeared hesitantly in the doorway, dressed carefully, in a simple gray suit, his expression carrying the same nervous uncertainty she remembered from his first unexpected visit to her shop weeks earlier. "I wanted to see if you needed anything before the ceremony begins," he said quietly, "or if you'd rather I simply take my seat and wait." Elena studied him for a long moment, the careful, cautious relationship they had rebuilt over these past weeks, still fragile, but genuinely growing, one honest conversation at a time. On impulse, feeling the warmth of this entire remarkable day settling over her, she extended her hand toward him.
"Would you walk me partway down the aisle?"
she asked. "Not all of it. Grace has already agreed to walk beside me the rest of the way, since she's been the one steady, dependable presence in my life since childhood. But perhaps you could walk with me from the house to the garden gate. It seems like an appropriate distance, given everything." Her father's eyes filled with tears at this offer, considerably more generous than he had clearly expected. "I would be honored," he said quietly. "Thank you, Elena. More than you know." The ceremony began shortly after, string music drifting softly across the garden, as Elena's father walked her carefully from the house to the garden gate, exactly as she had requested, before stepping back respectfully, to allow Grace to take his place beside her, for the remainder of the walk toward the flower-draped arch, where Damien waited, dressed in a simple dark suit, his expression carrying an open, unguarded joy that made Elena's breath catch the moment their eyes met across the garden. She walked toward him slowly, past rows of familiar, beloved faces, Priya smiling warmly beside her own family, Farah dabbing carefully at her eyes despite her usual brisk professionalism, Marco watching with quiet pride beside his own wife, and finally Sophia, seated in the front row, her sharp eyes streaming freely with joyful tears as she watched her grandson's face light up completely at the sight of his approaching bride. Reaching the arch, Grace kissed Elena's cheek gently before stepping back to join the gathered guests, and Elena finally stood face to face with Damien, both of them smiling through their own gathering tears, as the officiant began the ceremony that would formally bind together everything they had built these past several months, honestly and deliberately, through every difficult challenge they had faced, side by side. "We are gathered here today," the officiant began, "to celebrate a love that began, as I understand it, in rather unconventional circumstances." Soft laughter rippled through the gathered guests, and Elena caught Damien's eye, both of them sharing a private, knowing smile at the understated description of their chaotic, unlikely beginning. "But what began as an accident," the officiant continued, "has clearly grown into something entirely deliberate, entirely chosen, and entirely deserving of celebration today." The ceremony continued, through traditional vows and rings, though Elena and Damien had each written personal additions, small, honest promises, reflecting everything they had learned throughout their unconventional journey together. Elena spoke of learning to trust again, after years of guarded self-reliance, of finding in Damien a steadiness she had never expected to discover outside her own hard-won independence. Damien spoke of learning to choose his own path, rather than simply inheriting expectations, of finding in Elena the courage to pursue honesty, even when it complicated everything he had once believed was required to protect the people he loved. When the officiant finally pronounced them married, Damien kissed Elena gently beneath the flower-draped arch, and the gathered guests erupted into warm, joyful applause, Sophia's delighted laughter carrying clearly above the celebratory noise as she rose immediately to embrace them both. The reception that followed carried none of the careful, guarded performance of that first chaotic winter ball, instead filled with genuine warmth and easy laughter, as family and friends mingled freely beneath strings of soft golden lights hung across the garden. Elena danced with her new husband beneath the darkening evening sky, surrounded by flowers she had chosen and arranged herself, finally free of any misunderstanding or hidden agenda, simply celebrating a love that had grown, through every difficult and unexpected turn, into something entirely genuine and completely their own. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Elena found a quiet moment alone, with Sophia near the edge of the garden, both women watching the joyful chaos of the reception with matching contented smiles. "Do you remember," Sophia said quietly, "what I told you that very first night, when you asked if something was wrong with your dress? You said it was a lovely choice of color," Elena recalled, smiling at the memory, "for tonight of all nights." "I did," Sophia agreed, taking Elena's hand warmly in her own. "I think I knew, even then, watching you walk through those doors so nervous and confused, that you were exactly what this family needed, whether any of us understood it yet or not. Some mistakes, dear girl, turn out to be exactly the beginning we were always meant to find. Elena squeezed the older woman's hand gratefully, watching Damien across the garden as he laughed warmly with Priya and Farah, his entire posture radiating a relaxed, genuine happiness she had rarely witnessed during those earlier, more guarded days of their careful public arrangement. She thought of her father, seated quietly but contentedly among the other guests, of Grace, laughing freely beside him, in a tentative, growing reconciliation none of them could have predicted months earlier, of Victor Hale's unexpected role in ultimately strengthening, rather than destroying, the honest foundation of everything she and Damien had built together. Every difficult, unexpected turn of these past several months had led, somehow, exactly to this moment, standing in a flower-filled garden, surrounded by the family she had never expected to find, wearing a dress, chosen this time, with full, deliberate knowledge of exactly what Ivory meant within these particular walls. Damien found her again, as the evening wound down, pulling her close for one final dance beneath the twinkling garden lights, the string quartet playing something soft and slow, as the last of their guests began their own quiet goodbyes. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, resting his forehead gently against hers. "About how any of this began?" Elena considered the question seriously for a moment, thinking back over every complicated, frightening, joyful turn of the past several months, before shaking her head with quiet, complete certainty. "Not a single one," she said. "I borrowed the wrong dress, walked through the wrong door, and somehow found exactly the right life waiting for me on the other side. I wouldn't change a single complicated step of it, not for anything." Damien smiled, pulling her closer as they continued swaying gently beneath the garden lights, the golden glow of the evening settling warmly over the two of them, and the family, both given and chosen, that surrounded them completely. Whatever unconventional beginning had brought them together, whatever accident of fabric and family tradition had first thrown their lives into each other's paths, Elena understood now, standing here in her husband's arms on the happiest night of her life, that some mistakes were simply love's quiet, patient way of finding exactly the people who were always meant to find each other. Months later, once the wedding excitement had settled into the comfortable rhythm of ordinary married life, Elena found herself standing in her shop early one morning, arranging a fresh delivery of spring tulips, while sunlight streamed warmly through the front windows. The little shop had grown considerably busier since the wedding, curious customers occasionally recognizing her from the widely shared photographs of that unconventional, joyful garden ceremony. Though Elena had worked carefully to ensure her business remained grounded in the same honest, careful craftsmanship that had built its reputation long before any winter ball had ever complicated her ordinary life. She had finally hired a second full-time assistant, a quiet, capable young woman named Priyanka, who reminded Elena, in the best possible ways, of her own early determination when she first took over this small, struggling storefront years earlier. Oliver, now attending community college part-time, still worked weekends, proudly telling anyone who would listen about witnessing history the day he walked in on Damien's proposal. Damien arrived at his usual mid-morning time, though his visits had grown less frequent since he had taken on considerably more responsibility within the family business, a role he now approached with renewed purpose and integrity, following the transparent resolution of the earlier investigation. He kissed Elena's cheek warmly, setting down 2 coffee cups exactly as he had that very first morning, weeks before their engagement, though now he needed no guessing about how she took hers. "Sophia called this morning," he said, settling into one of the shop's familiar mismatched chairs. "She wants to know if we're free for dinner this weekend. Apparently she's been experimenting with a new recipe she insists on testing on willing family members before serving it at any actual gathering." "We're free," Elena said, smiling as she continued arranging the delicate tulips before her. "Tell her I'll bring dessert, as long as she promises not to critique my baking the way she critiques everyone else's cooking." "I make no promises on her behalf," Damien said, laughing warmly. "You know her well enough by now to understand that particular habit isn't likely to change anytime soon." They spent a few quiet minutes together, before Damien needed to leave for his morning meetings. The easy, comfortable rhythm of their daily life together, feeling entirely natural now. So different from the careful, guarded performance of those earliest weeks following the ball. Elena watched him go, the brass bell chiming softly behind him, and returned to her tulips with a contented, quiet smile, grateful every single day for the strange, unlikely path that had led her here. Priya stopped by later that afternoon, now a regular visitor, rather than the wary rival she had once seemed, carrying news of her own recent engagement to a kind, unassuming architect she had met, appropriately enough, at Elena and Damien's own wedding reception. "Can you believe it?" Priya said, practically glowing, as she showed Elena her own modest, elegant ring. "After everything, after all those years of expected futures that never actually happened, I finally found someone entirely on my own terms." "I'm so happy for you," Elena said sincerely, embracing her friend warmly. "You deserve exactly this kind of genuine happiness, Priya, after everything." "We both do," Priya agreed, smiling. "Funny how it took an accidental dress and a ridiculous old family tradition to eventually lead us both toward exactly where we were always meant to be." Elena laughed at this, helping Priya select flowers for her own upcoming engagement celebration, grateful once again for the unlikely friendship that had grown from such an uncertain, tense beginning months earlier. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, Elena closed up her shop, locking the familiar door behind her, with the same quiet satisfaction she felt every single day, grateful for the ordinary, hard-working life she had built entirely through her own careful effort, now beautifully, unexpectedly complicated by a love story that had begun with nothing more than a simple, honest mistake. She thought often, in these quiet, grateful moments, of that terrified young woman, rushing up the Castellano estate's front steps, months earlier, hands shaking, completely unaware that a single borrowed dress was about to change the entire course of her life. She would tell that frightened younger version of herself, if she could, not to worry so much about the mistake itself, but to trust instead, in the strange, patient way that love sometimes finds exactly the people it means to bring together, however unconventional or accidental the path required to get there. Walking home through the familiar streets near the harbor, evening light gilding the water gold and soft, Elena Castellano smiled quietly to herself, grateful beyond measure for every complicated, unexpected step of the remarkable journey that had led her here, to a life built honestly, deliberately, and completely on her own, carefully chosen terms, alongside a man who had chosen her back, again and again, through every difficult challenge they had faced together, exactly as fiercely and completely as she had chosen him. And somewhere, in the quiet, golden light of that ordinary evening, the old Castellano tradition finally found its truest, most honest meaning. Not an accident of fabric or misunderstood color, but a promise made freely, chosen deliberately, and kept faithfully, exactly the way real love always finds its way home in the end.